mother of all talk shows is back. Unleashed, unabridged, uncensored, and unbelievable. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
As the world trembles on the brink of war throughout the world, starting in the Persian Gulf, the mother of all talk shows goes deep into the subject, into how and why it happened and what may well happen next, with expert guests from both sides of the Atlantic. We'll be looking at a situation that may well, in the next hours, maybe even while we're on air, spiral entirely out of control. And Boris Johnson got off his sun lounger and made the entirely unhelpful comment that Britain does not lament the death of the man being lamented by the biggest funeral in all human history, with millions out in every Iranian city. But we'll squeeze in a look at the donkey derby that is the Labour leadership stakes. Some of the horses appear to have died in the stalls, but we'll be looking at the confirmed runners and riders at least. So fasten your seatbelts, because tonight of all nights, this is going to be a bumpy ride. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet and SputnikNews.com. We're on FM 105.5 are the magic numbers in Washington, D.C., and on AM coast to coast across the United States of America. But we're also a radio show with pictures, which is quite unique, actually. You can watch us, as many of you are, in unprecedented numbers on the following portals and platforms. You can watch us on Facebook, on George Galloway Official, and on RT.com and RTUKnews.com, and indeed almost all RT portals nowadays. You can watch, of course, on YouTube, on George Galloway Official, and again on almost all of the RT platforms. If you are watching on Facebook and on YouTube, please share, and share with the audience. We want to build 1 million viewers and listeners just as quickly as possible. I suspect that tonight we may well get close to that for the very first time, because these are very dramatic, portentous, somber, and potentially catastrophic times. What happened in the early hours of Friday morning in the airport precinct at Baghdad International Airport to an internationally accredited diplomat with a diplomatic passport, a general of the Iranian armed forces, and many others, 9 others, were obliterated in seconds by a drone strike boasted of immediately by the United States government. The Pentagon was careful to insist in the first sentence that the action was at the direction of the president. So they made it clear, even before Donald Trump, with his rather obscure, low-resolution tweeting of an American flag, made it clear that this was an official operation. Let's get the first thing out of the way. This was an entirely illegal act of international terrorism. Remember that when you hear reference to the T word. This was a terrorist attack by a state, not just any state, but a state that has a seat on the Permanent Security Council of the United Nations, on an accredited diplomat on a diplomatic mission of another member state of the United Nations. This was a state-sponsored extrajudicial murder. It's important that this is kept in mind, because you will already have heard all kinds of quasi-mystical exculpations of this crime. There is no ground in international law for the action that the United States government took on Friday. It was an act of piracy. It was an act of international terrorism. The second thing that we have to put in place before proceeding to debate this matter is that the proximate cause of the events on Friday morning were not the attack on the US Embassy in Baghdad by Iraqi citizens just a few days before, but were the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear treaty by the United States of America, which ripped up a solemn and binding treaty that Iran was abiding by impeccably, ripped it up unilaterally, and began a round of not sanctions, but absolute embargo on the Iranian people, 80 million strong, half of them young people, many of them children, now suffering, even dying as a result of American sanctions, which characteristically they have sought to extraterritorialize, to force other people into implementing their unilaterally imposed sanctions. That's where this begins. There was a treaty. It was working well. Donald Trump ripped it up. And to the horror of every other party to the treaty, including Great Britain and the European Union and the Permanent Five of the Security Council, minus the United States. All other actions have flowed ineluctably from that. The United States has been effectively trying to strangle the civilian population of Iran, 80 million of them, so that they rise up against their government and overthrow it in a classic regime change operation. Classic even for Iran. In 1953, the United States and Britain ignominiously played exactly the same role in trying to secure the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mr. Mossadegh. It's a repeat of the Operation Mongoose of 1953, which seeks to bring about entirely illegitimately, illegally, the overthrow of a sovereign government, a member state of the United Nations. Now, the events at the US Embassy only happened because Donald Trump bombed a camp belonging to a part of the Iraqi National Army. The Popular Mobilization Forces are a legitimate, accredited part of the Iraqi armed forces. I remind you that until today, and I'll come back to that, the United States was in alliance with the government of Iraq, whose armed forces Donald Trump attacked. He killed 25 people. By the way, many of them were Yazidis. Yes, the very Yazidis over whom we cried such crocodile tears when they were in the grisly hands of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. The bombing of the PMF camp killed 25 people, and when the crowd had finished burying them, they headed for the US Embassy. They did some peripheral damage to the US Embassy. General Suleiman had nothing whatsoever to do with the events at the American Embassy. He was not in Iraq when these events took place. It was not Iranians who were attacking the US embassy. It was Iraqis. Now, the circumstances which govern the presence of US troops and other forces, and British forces, by the way, 700 British forces in Iraq, now cowering down for what will be the inevitable Iranian retaliation, are strictly governed by agreement with the government of Iraq, which decided today that the United States forces, and indeed all of the coalition forces, must leave Iraq. Now, you'll recall we invaded Iraq to introduce democracy. The Iraqi government is a democratically elected government. It has just ordered the United States to leave. It will therefore be, again, an act of international lawlessness if the United States refuses to leave a country whose sovereign, legitimate government has just ordered them to leave. Now let's come on to the more dramatic, more portentous issues. As you will have seen today from the footage, if you are on social media, of the biggest funeral in the history of the world, General Soleiman has been received, his remains have been received by millions of people, millions, in every city in Iran through which the coffin has now passed. There were millions in Awaz, there were millions in Mashhad, and there will be perhaps uncountable millions in Tehran, where he will meet his final resting place. Bear that in mind too, because Donald Trump likes to convince you that the Iranian people are against their government, just looking for an opportunity to overthrow it. That if the United States were to overthrow it, they, like the occupation forces in Iraq, would be greeted by flowers and sweets. Anyone who still believes that, after the scenes of these funerals today in Iran, needs their head carefully examined by a doctor. It's absolutely self-evident that this murder of Soleimani has brought the Iranian people together, left, right, and center, reformist and hardliner. Even the nationalist Iranians outside of the country who have absolutely nothing in common with the governance of the Islamic Republic. This is an affront to all Iranians. Only paid stooges to be accepted from that statement. Virtually every Iranian in the world is outraged and united by this act of Donald Trump. Now, President Rouhani, my former distinguished constituent in Glasgow, now the president of Iran, visited the family home of General Soleimani earlier today. His weeping daughters asked President Rouhani, "Who will avenge our father?" And instantly the president, a moderate, replied, "Don't worry about that for a second. All of us will be his avengers." So, that's why I say that there is nothing more certain in this life than that the Iranians will retaliate in a proportional way. And what would be a proportional way to the murder of the second most important person in the country? Effectively, like a foreign government boasting that it had murdered the heir to the throne of Great Britain, for example, or the crown prince of anywhere in the country. What would be a proportionate response to that? Well, it will not be a stray minor rocket attack on an American camp in Kenya, though that did happen today, or a stray rocket attack on American troops' barracks in Iraq itself. It will be very, very much more significant than that. Neither will it be hidden by the Iranians. They will not seek to blame it on proxies. It will be their act or acts, and they will make it clear to the world that they have carried it out. And for it to be remotely proportionate, it will have to be extremely big. Now, that will inevitably beget a further response from the United States. Earlier today, Donald Trump tweeted this: The United States just spent $2 trillion on military equipment. We are the biggest and by far the best, in capitals, in the world, exclamation mark. If Iran attacks an American base or any American, we will be sending some of that brand new, beautiful equipment their way and without hesitation. Their way without hesitation. So the scene is set. If any American or any American base is attacked by Iran, it's game on. It's all out war between the United States and it hopes its allies, one of which is guaranteed, but only one is guaranteed, that being Netanyahu's Israel, for whom all of this is a splendid and welcome distraction from Mr. Netanyahu's impending imprisonment. Now, if Iran were to attack anywhere, it's my guess that it will not be in Iraq, because the situation in Iraq has moved decisively in Iran's favor. The Americans are being expelled from the country. Many of the hitherto disparate political factions in Iraq are coming together in defiance of the United States' action on sovereign Iraqi soil. It's my sincere belief that neither will it be in Israel, although Iran's rhetoric often hypes its potential to strike Israel. I don't believe that that will be the site of Iran's retaliation. The site of Iran's retaliation, in my view, will be in the Persian Gulf, where, to use a Rumsfeldism, there is a target-rich environment. The Saudi dictatorship is host to a truly gigantic American military presence. It's also, of course, one of the world's biggest oil producers. It's very near Iran. It has an ancient enmity between the two countries. It has a Shiite religious minority in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which may very well rise up against the tyranny of the Wahhabist dictatorship in Riyadh, which routinely crucifies and murders members of that Shiite minority, which is more than 20% of the population of Saudi Arabia. If Iran hits Saudi Arabia and sends its oil fields into Australian levels of fire, then there will not be a barrel of oil to be procured in the world at less than $500. That's my prediction. An oil price shock that will destabilize the world economy instantly. The price of oil already steadily rising before a shot has been fired by the Iranians in retaliation. But there are others. There are others, in particular, like Bahrain. It's my belief, I have no internal information on this, of course, but I do know about military and political events. And I do know the demography and the topography of the Middle East very well. It's my belief that the Iranian attack in response to the murder of General Soleimani will take place in Bahrain, where an exceedingly target-rich environment exists, where you have an overwhelming Shiite minority population ruled over by a tiny and ridiculous comic opera, Gilbert and Sullivan Sunni monarchy, which only exists because across the causeway in Saudi Arabia, it has limitless support from Saudi Arabia. So if you attack Bahrain, you're also attacking Saudi Arabia. But here's the rub. The US 7th Fleet is based in Bahrain, as is, thanks to the government of Theresa May, a brand new British naval base, where naval assets from both countries shelter. Now, Bahrain is a very small place. It's the size of a very large car park. And in that car park, you have the possibility of hitting British, American, Saudi, and Bahraini targets in a way which can obliterate Bahrain as an independent state. My logic is that that is the place where Iran will strike. But wherever it is, it will be responded to, according to Donald Trump on Twitter, without hesitation, in moments. And then we've got a very big quagmire, a very big bonfire indeed. Because when Donald Trump responds, Iran will respond again, and Donald Trump will respond again, and Iran will respond again. The Straits of Hormuz will be closed and on fire. The Saudi oil fields, perhaps on fire. The Qatari and Emirati oil fields on fire. You won't be able to buy a barrel of oil by that time at any price. And so the international economy will come crunching to a halt. And that's before you factor in what the attitude will be of Iran's friends. Its big friends, Russia and China, and its smaller friends, Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. Its friends in the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and elsewhere. You feel me? I'm not necessarily talking about World War III, but I am talking about war throughout the world. And if that isn't enough to make you sit up straight and pay attention, I really don't know what would. This is the mother of all talk shows.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, was loudly bemoaning earlier today in Washington the lack of support he'd received from European leaders. He singled out France and Germany, but he said even the British had not been helpful or supportive enough. Boris Johnson was, of course, sunning himself in Moustique. Is that how you say it? Moustique, some island anyway in the Caribbean. So perhaps he was out of earshot of international events. Lo and behold, he has now spoken. And the words that he has spoken are distinctly unhelpful, pleasing to Mike Pompeo, but not pleasing to most, I think, of the British population, judging by political reactions so far in this country to the crisis in the Gulf. Boris Johnson says we shall not lament the death of the man that many millions of Iranians are on the street lamenting. Now, that will come as a very, very bitter blow to the family of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who is wasting away unjustly in an Iranian prison cell. It may well cook her goose. She may well now find new charges brought against her, a new trial, and the chances of her release on the back of Boris Johnson, who played quite a big part, actually, in her incarceration in the first place with his lazy stupidity, may well be held responsible. We've got a poll on it. What should Boris Johnson do next? A, back Trump. B, oppose Trump. C, remain neutral. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. I'm joined by one of our brightest guests, a regular now on the show, Patrick Christys, writer and broadcaster. I want to talk about UK politics generally with you, but let me ask you first about the British government's response to the Gulf crisis. Pompeo was not happy by the absolute silence, which I took to be diplomatic silence, on the part of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson has now spoken. Do you think it's helpful, what he said?
No, I thought it was quite a weak response that aimed at pleasing both sides, but probably pleases none of them, to be perfectly honest with you. I am very concerned about the current situation. My great-grandparents lived through World War I, my grandparents lived through World War II. I don't want to live through World War III. And the issue...
won't live through it. We'll all be dead.
Well, there you go.
If it happens.
Well, there you are. Look, my concern for this is that we may, as the UK now, get dragged into some kind of conflict that we will be led into by a kind of tangerine-skinned bloke who doesn't tend to make very sound decisions. We're led to believe that this decision to kill Soleimani was made in Mar-a-Lago, preferably quite near a golf course, we understand. This is not the way that international politics, the chess match of international politics, should play out. Donald Trump...
Both Bush and Obama rejected this option of killing Soleimani in previous administrations. And it said in the New York Times today that the Pentagon officials were astounded that Trump plumped for this option.
I think, personally, the reason that they were astounded, apart from maybe all of it, really, is that actually it necessitates an Iranian retaliation. This guy, as you well know, George, is almost the kind of military David Beckham of that part of the world. I mean, there are animated films of him blowing up US warships. He's the definition of a hero. And the idea that the Iranians will just do nothing now is nonsense. So they will do something, whatever that is. And then, obviously, it's how Donald Trump reacts to that. And, well, if we've got anything to go by, it's going to be pretty epic for all the wrong reasons. So where does that realistically leave us? And especially in this post-Brexit world, are we going to be forced into a situation where we have to follow America like a lapdog into a war in the Middle East, whether that's a proxy war or a direct war? That's not a situation I want to be in.
Quite so. Boris Johnson went on holiday. A lot of people criticised it. I didn't myself. I think he's entitled to a holiday. But it did come at an unfortunate time, as these things tend to do. Should he have come back earlier?
I personally think he should have come back earlier. He was quite content to speak through his mouthpiece, Dominic Raab, initially, and I thought that was probably a mistake. What I will say, though, I think is politically he wanted to distance himself, probably both geographically and in terms of vocally as well, from the situation.
Yeah, it was the equivalent of, I can't hear you.
So we're going through a tunnel.
Going into a tunnel. Yeah, that's how I read that. But I'm not sure that it's worked out all that well for him. Well, and I'm not sure that Dominic Raab is the man I'd choose to be my mouthpiece.
He always looks like a rabbit in the headlights, doesn't he?
Yeah, a little, and also geographically challenged. You'll recall during the Brexit issue, he didn't seem to know that much about international affairs. Let me switch it to the Labour Party, because you're a man that is across all the political events in Britain. As I put it earlier, some of the horses appear to have died in the stalls. Yvette Cooper has pulled out of a race she hadn't actually joined.
Yes.
David Lammy has pulled out of a race he hadn't actually joined. There's two horses down for a start. The metaphors are swimming through my head right now. But there are others, including the bookies' original favourite, Rebecca Long Bailey, who may not have died in the stalls, but she hasn't said a whinny. She has been entirely silent since this whole thing began. Who do you think's the man or woman to watch?
I mean, look, I think the smart money at the moment will probably be on Sir Keir Starmer. Whether or not that's what they need, or whether or not, to be honest with you, any of the candidates are necessarily what this Labour Party needs at the minute is up for debate. I think the Labour Party's got itself into a new pickle, as it were, if it wasn't already in one. Enough. Jess Phillips, we're hearing today,
remarkable,
is coming out and
she's
saying...
going to campaign to rejoin the European Union.
OK, all right, that's... I mean, replace the longest suicide note in history and just
with the shortest one.
That line. That's that. How tone-deaf can you be? That's one of the reasons why the Labour Party suffered a massive defeat the last election, was their indecision over Brexit and the probability that their government would end up leading us back into the European Union. So if she really wants to go down that line, then fine, but I think she's going nowhere.
Well, a Labour Party that campaigned to rejoin the European Union would be committing political suicide, and yet she is the third favourite in the running.
What I think is interesting is the way that Labour Party elects its leaders, which is clearly just entirely off a membership base. So, actually, their membership
base...
Well,
you need 21 MPs to nominate you.
That's true, absolutely. But I suspect that what she might be doing here is, again, rather naively, I think, pandering to just the people who might directly elect her in terms of that membership base, who probably are, for the vast majority of them, Remainers.
Well, so we keep being told, nobody ever produces any, any stats that prove that. But, we're told... overwhelmingly, the members of the Labour Party were for Remain and were for a second referendum. But whether they're for the madness of promising to rejoin the European Union after all this trouble that there's been, I've got my doubts about that. And she's also, it's paradoxical, she's the candidate clearly favoured by Mr. Murdoch and his newspapers, but he doesn't want to rejoin the European Union, I wouldn't have thought.
No.
And she's also, maybe, I don't know, she's looking for the Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair kind of organs, newspapers, money, and so on. Do you think that might be behind it?
I think potentially. Well, look, what I think realistically is the case is that there's a credibility gap at the moment with a lot of these candidates. And so if you look at Jess Phillips, yes, I think it would be quite entertaining to see her at the dispatch box shouting at Boris Johnson. And just in terms of...
Personally, I hope she gets it.
I think it would
that's for entirely partisan reasons. And nothing would, for me, demonstrate the absolute bankruptcy of the British Labour Party than having this, how shall I put it, occasionally foul-mouthed woman as their leader. But I doubt it'll happen. I think you're right. Keir Starmer is the horse to beat, isn't he?
Yeah.
Tell the viewers and listeners, especially those abroad, more about Keir Starmer.
Well, Keir Starmer is widely regarded as one of the preeminent legal minds in this country. He's obviously been knighted and he's been
the Queen's Counsel.
Absolutely. He's regarded as a formidable intellectual. If you take his politics out of it, he is regarded as an intelligent bloke. And he is seen to be someone who is probably the more statesman-like out of the other Labour candidates. He is naturally more central. And what we're hearing today is that if he were to emerge as the new Labour leader, they would try to do a momentum, but with more centrists, and i.e. try and flood that Labour membership back with people more aligned to a central political outlook and drag it away from that kind of far left, as it were, element. So I think he would look to remodel the Labour Party. Out of the candidates that I'm seeing, in my personal opinion, he's the one who could give Boris Johnson the best run for his money at a national election.
He'd play the QC, forensic, repetitive, deadly boring.
For Boris, because he's not over the granular detail, Boris Johnson.
Well, quite. Boris Johnson, the bluster, the Latin, the jokes and the japes. Starmer would try to be bowling steadily at him in the hope of getting wickets.
Yeah, and you would have thought as well that maybe Keir Starmer could entice back in some of the people who have left the Labour Party because they didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. And I think, as well, when you looked at some of the scandals, whether or not they should have been scandals up for debate, but the anti-Semitism issue, let's say, that was gripping the Labour Party, I don't think...
That's disappeared.
It has.
There's anti-Semitism is no longer a problem in Britain. It's official.
But my point is, just in a political sense, I think Keir Starmer would have found a way to put that to bed, and as opposed to the 2 and a bit years that Jeremy Corbyn let it, in a way, drag on for. And so there's something in that. I think Boris Johnson probably is sitting there thinking Keir Starmer is his biggest test.
You think he's the one that Boris
Well, it's definitely
fears.
not Rebecca Long-Bailey.
No, let's come on to her. She is a woman who has risen without trace. I personally have never heard her speak. I've never seen her. I've never met her. And yet she's the official Corbyn continuity candidate. I see no evidence, no reason to believe, including her total silence to date in this campaign, this contest, where her opponents are already off and running. I see actually nothing that commends her as the next leader of the Labour Party. Can you give me a reason or two why she'd be a credible, serious candidate?
It's genuinely one of life's greatest mysteries to me, this. How Rebecca Long-Bailey has managed to propel herself, or been propelled, I suspect, up towards the upper echelons of the Labour Party. I don't know what she stands for politically. We keep hearing that she's this continuity candidate. What I've heard from her over the years is that she's seen a leader of a party, she's seen what's maybe been most politically advantageous to herself, and she's agreed with him. The Labour Party, as we know, do want a female leader, and all right, OK, there's a case for that, although I think most people would argue...
Nobody that lived through Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May is automatically attracted to that idea.
Exactly, and I think, on a personal note, she should just be the best candidate for the job. And I don't see that is her. She's not a particularly good orator from everything that we've heard her say.
She's definitely not.
She's not, and also she has got that Dominic Raab-esque rabbit in the headlights look. What I will say is this, is I have some friends in the Conservative Party, they hope that Rebecca Long-Bailey gets elected, and that should be a concern for Labour voters.
And that's just about it, isn't it? I mean, there are also Rands, Lisa Nandy and so on, but they're make-weights in this contest, aren't they?
I think so, yeah.
And so when will this all be over, Patrick? I think on Monday they decide the timetable. What is it likely to be?
Well, I'm not 100% sure at the moment, George, I'll be very honest with you, but I would expect that it'll probably be I think it's a 3 or 4 week period, is it not, after they decide the timetable, that the Labour membership has to vote in that. So I think that what we'll see then is...
So you think by February we'll know?
I would expect so, and I certainly think as well that we will see one of the 3 that we've just mentioned drop out along the way, and I think we'll end up seeing more of a 2-horse race. I would expect that Jess Phillips, potentially, I could be wrong over this, Jess Phillips might be doing this initially to boost her own platform a little bit. If she doesn't get a lot of early, for want of a better phrase, momentum, then I suspect that she will pull away and she may fall into line behind, I would expect, Keir Starmer as opposed to Rebecca
Yes, all the arguments for a woman leader will then fall away when you're supporting a man. There's, I don't call him a joker, I don't mean it that way, but there is a joker in the pack. Ian Lavery, the chairman of the Labour Party, former leader of the British Miners' Union, a northern man, so northern many southerners can't understand what he's saying.
Fine by me.
Is a working class hero. He fought the miners' strike from first day to last day. He may not be the sharpest House of Commons debater and so on, but he would be absolutely emblematic of the very Midlands and North that Labour lost catastrophically on election day. He may not stand. If he does stand, can he get 21 MPs to nominate him? Clearly, to me, there are not 42 left-wing MPs, nothing like it. So either him or Rebecca Bailey would have to drop out. But if he were the continuity candidate, I think that would make a difference. What's your view?
What really annoys me, and has annoyed me since this election, is a lot of people coming out saying Labour won the argument. The argument was the general election, and they got battered, right? And one of the reasons they got battered was not actually just because of Corbyn's policies. In fact, on paper, some of those policies, if he could have costed them up properly, would have been all right. The issue was, in my opinion, Jeremy Corbyn and where he was from, i.e. the kind of Islington area. In Ian Lavery, you've got a Brexiteer, a working-class hero, who is northern. Right? He could have, in my opinion, have proposed a lot of the similar policies as Jeremy Corbyn did, and quite possibly won, or certainly come very, very close. Sometimes, in my opinion, the answer is staring you right in the face, and maybe has been for quite a while. And if the Labour Party decide that Rebecca Long-Bailey should be their hardest left candidate, as it were, over Ian Lavery, then you might as well just wave goodbye to her.
That's my view. That's funny, and you and I haven't discussed this. That's my view entirely, actually, because of course, the smart people in the metropolis would mock him. They'd mock his accent. They'd mock his lifestyle. You know, flat cap, pub, beer. I don't know if he smokes.
Probably got a whippet there as well, you know.
It might have a whippet. But in the act of mocking him, they would be re-identifying northern people, Midlands people, with the Labour Party, because the people who live there look like, sound like, act like him. And so these people would themselves feel attacked by the metropolitan elite. In my view, it would be a stroke of genius for Labour to put up Ian Lavery, which is probably why they won't do it. Look, we've only got a few minutes left. We mustn't ignore the elephant in the room that you and I have been talking about for so many years. In just a few weeks, couple of weeks, not even 2 weeks, we'll be leaving the European Union. What will that feel like? I mean, when we wake up on February 1st, what are the things that will immediately be apparent to us?
Well, I suppose initially, maybe not too much. However, what we are going to enter into is 11 months' worth of negotiations. And what I think is going to be a key difference for this, and when we've done it before, is there's going to be a gradual recognition that actually, in my opinion now, we have started to have the upper hand. If not, certainly, we've definitely levelled the playing field. Boris Johnson's huge majority has done that for us, but also his bullish nature and also the people behind the scenes working on it. Look, I think that the fact is that now we have a trade-off to make and a decision to make as a nation, which is that are we willing to forego competitive advantage in order to have essentially tariff-free trade with the European Union and to give them access to our fishing waters? And the answer to that question will dictate what kind, if any, Brexit deal that we get. I just think that on February the 1st, when we wake up, we are going to see a front-foot Britain, as opposed to the kind of tractor stuck in thick mud that was Theresa May's premiership, and that is good.
Just in practical terms, I wake up, I decide to go to Amsterdam. Will I need a visa?
No. No, not initially, because we've got a year-long, well, 11-month-long, as it were, transition period where essentially everything remains the same. But even thereafter, I mean, this idea that we should need a visa to start going to play, you know, holiday to wherever we go on the continent there, it's
that would require Spain or Portugal or the Netherlands to demand a visa.
And why would they? Yeah, but this is
they want us to go there and spend our money.
Yeah, you can make us get a visa.
And their people want to come here and visit England, Scotland, Wales. Yeah. So there's kind of no, all this apocalyptic talk that the Remain camp talked millions of British people into, that somehow we were cutting ourselves off from the continent even though we've never been attached to it. It's balderdash, isn't it?
Yes, and I would keep an eye on the markets as well, because what we were told was the second that Brexit becomes a almost tangible reality, as it were, we're going to drop off a cliff and it's going to be terrible. What markets thrive off, arguably wrongly, is confidence, right? And Boris Johnson, again, like him or loathe him, and I suspect plenty of people loathe him, he is a very confident man, and he's very good at portraying a positive view of Britain. And I know that the markets, for example, will still feel a boost off the fact that Boris Johnson is in charge as opposed to Jeremy Corbyn. That's just the way that they think, right? And so actually, I don't expect us to fall off a cliff economically in the short term or the long term.
Patrick Christys, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. What should Boris Johnson do next on the Persian Gulf crisis? A, back Trump. 23% of you say yes, back Trump. B, oppose Trump. 49% of you. And C, remain neutral. 28%. That's a surprisingly large number of people say we should back Trump. To me, 1,521 votes so far. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Now, you know, I've been right so many times, I've lost count. And I've been right so many times over such a long period, I can barely remember it. And so when an old video of mine was relaunched by somebody on social media over the last 2 days, I was quite surprised to see it. It was me talking quite a long time ago about the danger of war with Iran. It's had 1 million views in the last 2.5 days. Take a look at it now. Well, let me just tell you that if they fire on the Islamic Republic of Iran, they will be opening the gates of hell. This is not Iraq in 2003. Iran is not a broken-backed country with an unpopular leader, with no friends and allies in the region or the world. Iran is a vibrant, powerful country of nearly 80 million people, most of them young people, most of them united. United at least in their rejection of foreign interference in their country, of a foreign attack upon their country. And Iran is militarily strong in the way that Iraq was militarily weak. The Iranians can fight back, and they will fight back. The drone that they brought down, they say in their territorial waters, gives an indication of the ability and power of their military. They have millions of men, and women for that matter, either under arms or ready to be under arms. For many of those, it would be a pleasure to fight the United States and its allies in the region. And I want to turn to those allies in a minute. Because whichever Persian Gulf country allows its land to be used for the launching of an American attack on Iran will itself immediately be in flames, probably within the hour. The Straits of Hormuz, through which 35% of the world's oil flow, not American oil, by the way, they buy almost none of it, but it will bring the economy of many places, including yours, grinding to a halt within days or weeks. 35% of all the world's oil will be passing through or not passing through a narrow strait that the Iranians can and will easily block. Iran is also unlike Iraq in that it has friends in many, many places, strategically important places. Let's start with the obvious one. When Britain and the United States broke Iraq, it automatically made Iran powerful in Iraq. Iraq has millions of allies in Iraq, all of them armed or easily able to be armed. So the first place that will pay the price for a Donald Trump attack on Iran will be American assets and allies in Iraq. In Qatar, in the UAE, from which the drone that was shot down took off, and particularly in Saudi Arabia. Their oil fields are absolutely vulnerable to Iranian counter-attack, and their leadership, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are held responsible in Iran for American designs to attack their republic. In Lebanon, Iran has millions of friends. It has a whole powerful guerrilla army that are its friends in Lebanon. Hezbollah, inside Palestine, throughout the Persian Gulf region, throughout the world, Iran has friends. And that's why we say, pull these airplanes away. Sail those aircraft carriers back away as far as possible from Iran's borders. This constant ratcheting up of war fever can only end in disaster for all of us. Iran was complying with the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Everybody else in the world agrees on that, except the United States and its satrapies. No more war. No war in the Gulf. No war on Iran.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Now, I'll be speaking on the Persian Gulf crisis. I've no idea what it will be like by then, but next Friday at 7 p.m. That's Friday the 10th of January at 7 p.m. in London at the Saklatvala Hall, Saklatvala, Saklatvala Hall, Dominion Road, UB2 5AA. The nearest station is Southall. There'll be an Eventbrite set up. It's organised by the anti-war organisation NoGulfWar.org. NoGulfWar.org if you want any further details on that. And the Eventbrite will be up very quickly. I'm also speaking at the East Kilbride Village Theatre on the 18th of January. There are not many tickets left, so if you are planning on going to that, you really better get them in the next 24 maybe 48 hours. The last time I looked, there were fewer than 50 seats left in a 310-seat capacity. So that's in Scotland, in East Kilbride, at the East Kilbride Village Theatre. And I'll be speaking in Birmingham probably on the 1st of February. Details to follow. Now the poll, my goodness, it's going great guns, if you'll forgive the pun. 2,432 votes so far. What should Boris Johnson do next? A, back Trump, 23%. B, oppose Trump, 49%. C, remain neutral, 28%. And we've got calls coming in on that subject. Alex is in Manchester. Let's hear from him. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hello, George.
Hi there.
Thank you very much for your show.
Welcome. What would you like to say?
Thank you. I just wanted to point out a few things. Before anything, I just think this is like World War One. Archduke of Ferdinand of Austria got
the heir to the throne. The heir to the throne being murdered. Yeah, it is. In fact, Franz Ferdinand began to trend on Friday, and the band Franz Ferdinand put out a tweet saying, "For what it's worth, we think World War III is a very bad idea." So very well observed, Alex. Go on.
Also, I just wanted to point out that a couple of other incidents have happened in the last 24 hours before it. One of them was New York Times publishing an article a few hours before it calling the general, the former general.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you're aware of that.
No, that's interesting, yeah.
Okay, and also BB's Twitter account posted 24 hours before something like this will happen.
Yeah, so did Donald Trump's son, actually, and then deleted it a few days before.
Yeah, well, this is what I'm trying to say. This is like his whole stage, and I think the contractor that they won't name that was assassinated...
Well, they keep talking about our contractor, but they haven't said who he is.
That's the point. I think that's a spy. That's why they're not mentioning who he is. And I've got a funny idea it might actually be a Mossad agent, and that's why.
What's that funny idea based on, Alex?
Because apparently they tried to assassinate in Mossad, and they failed.
But it wasn't an assassination in Kirkuk. It was the shelling of a camp. So there was no assassination involved. It was random mortar fire into a camp in Kirkuk, many hundreds of miles from where any of the Shiite, largely Shiite, Popular Mobilization Forces were operating, and they have denied that they did that shelling in the first place. But it is suspicious that the US will not name this contractor on whose death the whole world is being hurtled into war.
But that's why.
Sorry, losing you, Alex. Now let's go to line 2. Syed Hassan in Phoenix. Syed Hassan, I presume you're another Syed Hassan. If you were Syed Hassan Nasrallah, you wouldn't be in Phoenix. Go on.
That's funny, George. But yes, it's close to the same name. Yes, I am Syed Najmul Hassan. That's my full name. Originally, I'm from Pakistan, but I'm settled here in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay.
And
it's a nice place. I've spoken there, you know. I've given a speech. I've given a speech in Phoenix.
Yes, I have spoken to you before too when you used to be on Press TV. I have spoken to you 4 or 5 times.
Yeah. Anyway, go on.
On the press. So my question is that it's really a shameful act. I would say it's an act of terrorism that a high official of a country who is on an official visit to another country killed by a third country without any justification.
Yeah.
So it's really a shameful act. It's more about just pleasing Bibi Netanyahu and Israel.
It is a crime, but it's worse than a crime. It's a blunder. I don't think it's about pleasing Netanyahu. I caution you chaps not to go barking up the wrong tree. This is to please Saudi Arabia, not Bibi Netanyahu.
I agree with you to that, but yes, I agree with you. Yes, I agree with you that what you're saying that it's to please Saudi Arabia. Also, the whole discussion at this point is that the Iranians, they are not Iraq, they are not Arabs. I do let you know they have a history, and they are really proud. They don't say themselves they're Muslim. They proudly say themselves they are Iranians.
A very good point, and I myself was surprised by that. When I attended a conference of Iranian expatriates in Tehran some years ago, and Iranians had come from all over the world. Virtually none of them supported the Islamic Republic. Virtually none of them supported the system, Islamic system of government in Iran. But they were fiercely nationalistic and chauvinistic actually. And one or two of them even xenophobic against Arabs, for example. They were bristling with Iranian pride and nationalism.
Yes. So the concept of going and having an adventure in Iran, they are purely nationalist people, first of all, and they were going to fight back. They have a history. They were an empire, just like the Roman Empire. So you have to realize this is not a piece of cake.
Because Trump said on Twitter that Iran had never won a war, which makes you wonder how they had such a vast empire stretching all the way to Greece.
Yes, and the Iranians, they have a proud history, and the thing is that what you have mentioned, that the Iranians, when it comes to the national interests of nationalism of Iran, although even the liberal and the so-called atheist Iranians or anyone who lives even in the U.S., they don't want the religious regime, but they don't even either want the West or the U.S. to be involved in Iran. So they don't realize that it's not some XYZ Arab country where they're going to change the regime, they're going to create the rebels, and they're going to just make their own way. It's not a piece of cake. The Iranians will retaliate back. And the problem, the other is that, like, the Iranians, they have a lot of proxies in all the countries. It's more about religious affiliation. So they have people in Pakistan, they have people in Afghanistan, they have people all over the Muslim world.
Very well said.
I'm from Pakistan.
Very well said, Said. I'll let you know this. When I was in Arizona speaking at public meetings, it coincided with the Iranian presidential election, the first one that Ahmadinejad won, or it may have been the second. And to my astonishment, Iran allows Iranians living in America and overwhelmingly hostile to the regime in Tehran to vote for the president of Iran. And I went to a polling station in Arizona. 26 people voted that day. One of them even voted for Ahmadinejad. The others all voted against him. There's just a little local knowledge. Said Hassan in Phoenix, thank you very much indeed for that. Coming up to the news, I've got a whole pile of paper, emails, tweets, and so on, and we'll take as many of your calls as we can. 02077 982 255 if you're in Britain. If you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Let's get the news with Emily Horn.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Hundreds of thousands of mourners have taken to the streets in Iran as the remains of Qasem Soleimani are brought home. In the city of Avaz, people beat their chests and chanted "Death to America" following the death of the Iranian general. Soleimani was the architect of Iran's sphere of influence across the Middle East, and he was considered to be the country's second most powerful man. His assassination is marking a significant escalation between Iran and the U.S. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who had a close personal relationship with Soleimani, warned of severe revenge for the attack. Analysts now say Iran might pursue cyber attacks against the United States, traditional attacks on U.S. targets or interests in the Middle East. President Trump, who authorized the assault, an option refused by both Presidents Bush and Obama as too risky, says the U.S. is ready to strike 52 sites important to Iran and the Iranian culture. The president added that targets identified represented 52 Americans who were held hostage in Iran from late 1979 after they were taken from the U.S. Embassy. Iran's foreign minister has responded on Twitter, saying that the killing of Soleimani was a breach of international law and that any targeting of cultural sites would constitute a war crime. Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab is now urging Iran to take a diplomatic route to reduce tensions with the West and come in from the international cold. Raab has told the BBC the U.S. has a right to exercise self-defense. After its comprehensive defeat in the British general election, the Labour Party will now begin the process of choosing a new leader. Well, 5 candidates have so far entered the race to succeed Jeremy Corbyn. 2 of them say that the public did not trust Labour to deliver on many of its election commitments. The former shadow Brexit secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, who is the favourite, says its manifesto was overloaded and hampered Labour's ability to present itself as a force for good and a force for change. Jess Phillips says Labour lost trust on some of the basics, such as its broadband pledge to deliver free, high-speed broadband to every home. Shadow Business Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey, one of the favourites, is expected to officially declare her candidacy in the coming days. And Austria's foreign ministry has been targeted by a cyber attack that is suspected to have been conducted by another country. While the ministry said the seriousness of the attack suggested it might have been carried out by a state actor. The hack started on Saturday night, and experts warn it could continue for several days. The foreign ministry says it was recognized very quickly and countermeasures were taken immediately. Next, 6 German tourists have been killed and 11 injured in the Italian Alps when a car crashed into them. A suspected drunk driver collided with the group of young people in the town of Lüdeck in South Tyrol, a popular skiing destination. Reports suggested they had left a nightclub and were waiting to get a bus when the car then struck them. The driver of the car, a man in his late 20s, was arrested and is currently in hospital. Next, raging bushfires in Australia have turned the sky bright orange over Auckland in New Zealand, more than 1,200 miles away. People have also reported breathing difficulties caused by the smoke from the devastating blazes. A witness to the eerie spectacle has described it as apocalyptic. Hours before the sun was due to set, streetlights in Auckland were turned on early and motorists were forced to use headlights because the plumes of smoke made the skies so dark. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who is being criticised for his responses to the emergency, is warning that the devastating bushfires raging in the country may go on for months. At least 24 people have died since the fires began, and air quality in the capital was this weekend rated the worst in the world. And finally, it's been more than 2 years since the first allegations of sexual misconduct against Hollywood movie mogul Harvey Weinstein became public. And tomorrow, for the first time, he will find himself in a criminal court standing trial for his alleged crimes. The former Miramar studio boss is accused of 5 sex crimes, including rape and sexual assault against 2 women. If convicted, he could face a life sentence. Actress Rosanna Arquette will be in court to support his alleged victims. She has accused Weinstein of derailing her career after she resisted his advances and was one of the dozens of women to come forward and tell her story. Weinstein, who has been seen using a Zimmer frame in recent weeks, has pleaded not guilty to all charges and was freed on a $1 million bail, recently increased to $5 million. It's understood his lawyers will argue that all of the encounters were consensual. Well, that's all for Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
It's the mother of all talk shows, previewing, if you like, the mother of all wars that may well break out in the next hours, day or so, and indeed may already have done so. I'm getting breaking news from Reuters. Reuters is reporting missiles have fallen inside the green zone in Baghdad, and also casualty figures from the attack on a US base in Kenya that I referred to earlier. I'll get you the numbers there. But these are, I think, sporadic bushfires. I don't believe this is the Iranian response, but we'll see what these missiles in the green zone actually mean in just a few minutes. Jeffrey in Glasgow says, Dear George, being a completely one-sided and totally biased show run by loony leftists, my goodness, I'm looking through the glass, there's not a single loony leftist there, not one. I'm pretty certain that you will not read this letter. Don't you feel a pillock, Jeffrey? I would like to tell you that I totally support Trump's drone strike that killed the ruthless Iranian general who murdered thousands throughout the years. Jeffrey, I'd so love to talk to you. Here is my number, 02077 982 255. Give me a call. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Or are you just another gutless coward hiding behind anonymity on the internet? Now, Charles Shoebridge is a former army officer, former Scotland Yard detective, former counter-terrorism and intelligence officer, a lawyer, a writer, and a broadcaster. Pretty well qualified then to talk to us about this. And he joins me now on the line. Charles, welcome.
Hello, George, and
I'd like to say
turning out that way so far. I was going to say Happy New Year.
Well, you know that you've taken the words right out of my mouth. I was about to say Happy New Year to you, but it seems incongruous in the circumstances. Let's start with the immediate present. The news I've just broken about missiles in the green zone, 3, I think, and the attack by an ISIS outfit in coming out of Somalia, presumably into Kenya, on a base which seems to have killed some US intelligence personnel there. Do you agree with me that these are just skirmishes? This is not the real deal so far as the Iranian response to the Soleimani killing is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're going to see is random acts of revenge carried out on a local basis, not orchestrated by the Iranians. Far from it. Actually, this is, I think, probably spontaneous actions by people and militias and even perhaps individuals on the ground, certainly as far as Iraq. I mean, it's breaking news, as you say, about the issue in Kenya as it is in Baghdad. But certainly, of course, if it's ISIS that has carried out this attack in Kenya, of course, ISIS is one of the organizations that will be celebrating the death of this Iranian general, because it was the Iranian general, remember, in Iraq and also in Syria who pretty much devised the strategy on the ground ironically, in conjunction with U.S. airstrikes, which, of course, in Iraq and Syria.
Soleimani was operating shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. against ISIS in Syria.
Yeah, absolutely right, and in Iraq as well, of course. And, of course, therefore, this attack, if it's taken place tonight by ISIS in Kenya, this won't be in revenge for the killing of someone who was an enemy of ISIS.
No, of course.
And of course, how ironic that therefore would have happened on the same day that already we're seeing consequences, I think still on quite a low level, relatively speaking, to what they can be and what they will become in the future. The geopolitical consequences that are starting to become apparent, surely even to the American government, as to what its consequences are. And one of those consequences today is that the anti-IS Islamic State coalition in Iraq has suspended all of its operations because it now has to give all of its resources and devote its troops and so on to protecting their own bases against the Iraqi people and militias because of this drone strike. And so consequently, you've got a situation now where already anti-ISIS operations are being hampered by this strike. You've got actually Iran, of course, has today announced its suspension of all cooperation in respect of the nuclear deal. You've got the Iraqi parliament today having voted to expel US and indeed all foreign, including UK, forces from Iraq and to ban military flights from its airspace. And all of these, I think, are just the start. This is all in just one day. But I think what we're going to see is, I wrote an article on this recently, and I said that I think the effects of this will take a long time to play out, months, if not years. And I think as a direct result of the consequences of this strike that the Americans have carried out, you will see quite fundamental changes to the order of certainly the geopolitical situation in the Middle East in the next few months and years to come. And I think primarily amongst those will be a massive diminishing of US influence and role in the Middle East, not least because of the withdrawal of its forces.
Well, I agree with that in the medium term, and I have the benefit of having read your brilliant article, Disastrous Soleimani Decision Will Likely Hit US Politically, Economically, and in Blood by Charles Shoebridge. You can tell us later where people can read that, please, Charles. I agree with that in the medium and long term, but the short term is potentially catastrophic before we get there. Maybe none of us will get there. If you saw the tweet from Donald Trump earlier, I'm sure that if one American is harmed by Iran in retaliation, if one base is attacked, then some of his $2 trillion worth of military hardware will, without hesitation, be winging its way towards Iran. And Trump identified 52 sites, including sites culturally precious to the Iranians, imagine, that he has in that list of 52 places that he's going to attack. That would, of course, set the balloon up completely. We would be in a stage then of total war in the Gulf. Iran is not a weak power by any means. It's not a superpower like the United States. It has no nuclear weapons, a point which I'm going to ask you about in a minute. But can we get through the immediate present, even before we see these longer-term consequences?
The problem is, I think Trump is probably now realizing that he's dug himself very much into a hole. It's interesting today to see hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of just one city in Iran, let alone all the other cities. And they're not, as Trump's officials told the rest of the world. And I'm talking about the vice president, and I'm talking about the Secretary of State. These are high-level officials who promised that the people in the streets of Iran would be dancing with joy at the death of this general. Well, they're not.
It's turned out to be the biggest funeral in human history.
They're mourning the death of what they regard as their hero, and from their perspective, certainly with good grounds to regard him as a hero, and arguably even from our perspectives, given the work that this person did against ISIS and other terrorist groups. And of course, they're calling for vengeance. And I think that Trump probably even himself was told by these officials that the result would be the opposite of actually what the result is. And I think Trump has I think, shown how far out of his depth he is. He's relied on these officials to give advice. He's probably felt pressure to take action. There's an opportunity to strike this target that he possibly naively believed would actually be a useful negotiation.
A de-escalation.
Method.
You kill the second man in Iran, and it's a de-escalatory move.
It's interesting how they just don't seem to get it, and this is a common factor, I think, in Western policy generally, particularly British and American policy, that an inability to actually read how the other side will respond, and that's an inability to actually step inside the shoes of other people. Because let's face it, if the Vice President of the United States or the Chief of Staff of the United States, and this person, Soleimani, was pretty much both of those positions in Iran, if that person was killed by Iran, and a state act of Iran, as it was in America's case, it wasn't some proxy force, America carried out a state killing. If that happened, and then Iran called for de-escalation, we can think what the American response would be, and understandably so. And so yet they don't expect that to come from the Iranians. And let's not forget, the Iranians have many allies, not just in the region, but around the world. And it's really a matter of choosing, and over a period of time, what the response will be. And it's tragic, but sadly predictable to see the United Kingdom today having for 2 days almost shown independence from US foreign policy by not supporting, not condemning, but certainly not supporting the US actions. And today, of course, we've had Raab, the Foreign Secretary, coming out and doing just that. And so we join countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, and that's pretty much it in the whole world that have joined to support the American actions. And in doing so, certainly I think we start taking responsibility for what the consequences will be, just as we did in Iraq.
Now, one reading of what you've just said is that Trump was somehow misled by his officials about the consequences of this action. But the New York Times publishes today, doesn't make it true, of course, that the Pentagon officials were aghast, horrified, astounded that Donald Trump picked this option of the assassination from a list of potential U.S. actions presented to him at Mar-a-Lago. The New York Times implication is that the deep state knew that this was a very foolish thing to do, but the fool Trump has done it. Do you doubt that analysis?
No, I think that analysis is correct, and I think it's consistent with what I've just said, because I'm not suggesting that people who knew what they were talking about, such as the military professionals, they may have put the option to Trump, of course, but they will have certainly advised what the consequences are. But, of course, Trump is also taking advice from his officials, and by which I mean high officials such as Pence, such as Pompeo, and people really, we've got this whole problem, as you know, that since Trump has taken over, that first of all, of course, he's been hampered by the whole Russiagate allegations. Which
and the impeachment issue also?
The impeachment issue, but also, of course, you've got this constant demand that he shows how tough he is on Russia, on Iran, on Syria, and so on. And that's largely come from the media, which now, quite rightly actually, I think, including the New York Times, is criticizing him for his decision. It's difficult to find grounds to defend that decision having been made. But I also look back to the time when Trump didn't, quite wisely, withdrew his attack on Iran that was supposed to take place when Iran knocked out an unmanned US drone, which was only a few months ago. Trump said quite wisely, look, our estimate is we're going to kill hundreds of Iranians, and of course the subtext of that is, and there'll be lots of Americans killed in return, all for an unmanned drone. So actually I'll withdraw the attack. But he got criticised very heavily by the liberal media in the US and indeed in the UK for showing lack of spine and for allowing the Iranians to get away with it. Now, let's not forget, I'm not defending Trump's decision at all. It's a disastrous decision. But I think it may have played a part with him, particularly with the impeachment and an election coming up, that actually he may have seen this as an opportunity to look tough. And I really think he didn't actually understand what the deep consequences of this would be. And the sight of these hundreds of thousands of people on the streets and the lack of support that he's got from allies around the world, apart from that very short list of states that I've mentioned, I think will have come as a shock to him. That doesn't excuse it in any way, but now he's going to have to struggle to get out of this situation without the war that he promised the US people he wouldn't bring on the US people to happen, because let's face it, he's got an election coming up. He was elected on the mandate of not getting involved in any more of these pointless interventionist wars.
Just to buttress the point we both made, the civilian casualties are being reported after rockets struck inside the green zone in Baghdad near the US embassy. At least 5 rockets have been launched. Another missile landed on the riverbank adjacent to the American embassy. It's unclear who was responsible for the attack. Meanwhile, one U.S. service member and 2 U.S. Department of Defense contractors have been killed, and 2 Department of Defense members, in quotes, have been injured in an attack at Manda Bay Airfield by the Al-Shabaab terror group in Kenya. But the Green Zone rockets are Katyushas, buttressing the point we've both made that this is not the official response by Iran. We know how well tooled Iran is. If they attack American assets in the region, will they do it, as I predict, with ballistic missiles rather than Katyushas and mortars and random shootouts like this, in your view?
I suspect they will try and avoid a direct military confrontation with the US, and the simple reason for that is because they would lose that direct military confrontation. It would be symbolic, and I'm sure there's absolutely no shortage of volunteers in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere that would want to carry out such attacks, but they would be militarily futile. I suspect Iran has access to those kind of weapons that you've mentioned, but I think that would be so undeniable that was, if you like, an act of war, as indeed the Americans have carried out, that it would invite strong, clear retaliation and condemnation. Iran will work to leverage its assets that it's got in terms of its advantages. Now, Iran has strong capabilities, for example, as we've seen before many times in terms of drone warfare itself. It has advantages, for example, in cyber warfare. Certainly, it has the ability to attack U.S. targets, for example, the infrastructure systems of energy networks, of transport networks, financial networks, for example, in the United States. And this can cause great harm and financial cost. But also, of course, it has its allies and what the Western media would call its proxies around the world, including, for example, Hezbollah and the global link of other militias, including, of course, the Houthis in Yemen. And I think what we can expect is perhaps over a period of time, we can see actions, covert and overt, taken against U.S. allies, such as Saudi Arabia. We saw an attack which Iran denied, but which it certainly would have had advance notice of if not taking part in, on the Saudi refining facilities in the middle of last year, which, of course, showed that just with one attack, you can knock out a large proportion of the refining capability. And if that was to be sustained, that would massively, of course, increase the price of oil, which, again, could have a devastating effect on the West's economies, as indeed other people around the world. Similarly, they have the ability to close, for example, the Straits of Hormuz, to control the Gulf of the Persian Gulf, which, again, could restrict oil supplies. And indeed, that's why the British are saying that they've sent these 2 warships there. 2 warships which, if they remain independent of American control, may have a chance of avoiding becoming involved in a conflict. Of course, the Americans are desperate to show that they have allies because they have so few in this situation that they will put great pressure on Britain to combine their patrols with the American naval patrols, which, of course, will then bring Britain into that target zone. So it's, as you say, a highly dangerous, inflammatory situation, and not just for the US, but also for those allies that it has, those that haven't disassociated themselves from it. And Britain is key of those.
Well, finally, on that point, Charles, and I'm grateful for your time, the British diplomatic silence for the first 2 days was telling and referred to explicitly actually, by Mike Pompeo, that the European allies, including Britain, had not been supportive enough. Boris Johnson has now made finally a statement, quite an inflammatory one in my view. Will Britain be able to or want to remain neutral in all of this? Or are we going to start the Brexit era as the 51st state of the United States of America?
Well, you know, George, I've been on your program before and I've mentioned this, that I think in the post-Brexit world, certainly in the short term, and again, this isn't necessarily an argument for or against Brexit, I would point out before becoming involved in that discussion, but I would say that it's absolutely clear that Britain, I think, fears post-Brexit isolation. I think they have put, especially Boris Johnson, has put a lot of store on having good relationships with the United States, including he's often talking about his trade deal and so on, despite the problems that might bring. And therefore, I think Britain at this particular time, the last thing, not Britain wants to do, but that this government wants to do, is alienate itself from the United States at a time when its ties with Europe are loosening. And this is at a time when relationship between Europe and America generally are deteriorating precisely because of these kind of actions that America has taken. We've got a situation now where Iran has now fully, or appears to be fully, withdrawing from the nuclear deal that the European powers, including Britain, have struggled to keep alive since the US unilaterally withdrew from it and reneged on it. And so you've got a situation now where Britain is kind of almost like rudderless, in my view, on the international stage. They're being drawn towards America simply because of the rejection of Europe. Of course, it doesn't mean to say because you're not part of Europe or the EU that you can't side with European politicians or governments on these kind of issues. It's really clear that I think you've got, unfortunately, it's very similar to the situation. I haven't heard what you said on this specific aspect, but I'm sure you probably have thought about this in the same way that when the situation with Iraq 17 years was developing, indeed at about the same time of year, remember the invasion took place, I think, in March 2003. In the run-up to that, we were having exactly the same situation where a lot of false information was being put out by the US and UK government, and the UK government was doing everything it could to actually be supportive of the US at the very same time that had it pulled its true diplomatic weight, because let's face it, America in that also didn't have very many allies, or not very many powerful allies. Had Britain pulled its weight at that time, they might have persuaded the US to have pulled back, instead of course, Tony Blair actually encouraging George Bush to attack Iraq, with all of the horrific consequences that we've seen for Iraqis, for Europeans, and indeed Americans since then in terms of terror and so on. And I think there are parallels with this particular time. And I think it's extremely probably unhelpful to have the British government, which is a close ally of the US, actually now coming out and saying, we will stand firm with you, because it will simply give succor to the American side and discourage them from pulling back. And I think the consequences for the US and the UK not necessarily will be, but could be potentially disastrous. And I'm sure that in the end, the Iranians will actually come to a negotiated deal in respect of this, but they will exact a very heavy price. And really, given what's happened to them, it's not really surprising that that's the case. If it happened to us or to the United States, what the Americans have done, we absolutely would not just sit back and accept some kind of deal and offer that Trump is now belatedly hoping that the Iranians will accept.
Forgive me, one last question, Charles. The nuclear deal dead and buried now, does that mean Iran will produce a nuclear bomb? If I were them, I certainly would. But that would displease some of their own friends. Russia and China don't want Iran to develop a nuclear bomb. But if I was running Iran, I'd tell my scientists to get one on my desk, so to speak, yesterday.
Yeah, of course, this can't be developed overnight. And indeed, as even the International Atomic Agency has confirmed, that Iran hasn't had a nuclear weapons program for very, very many years, despite the constant allegations of Netanyahu and others that it has done. But nonetheless, so they're not going to be able to produce something overnight. But you're absolutely right. The message that this sends, this attack, if you like, an American assertion of its extraterritorial jurisdiction to carry out attacks like this and just kill members of foreign governments at will, it sends a very clear message. And the message, I think, is pretty much the same message that the attack on Libya, the attack on Iraq also sent. That is that if you want to avoid these kind of situations, if you want to have President Trump not attacking you and also other American governments not attacking you but coming to your door to negotiate with you, you need to be like Korea. You need to have weapons of mass destruction. And that, of course, is the most unhelpful message that could be sent. And that indeed may be one of the main long-term ramifications of this. Would that attack on this general have taken place if Iran has had nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction? And many people around the world, many governments and many future governments will come to the conclusion that given the risk of escalation to a nuclear incident that could take place, they will suspect that the only way to protect themselves from this kind of American use and abuse of its power is indeed to obtain their own WMDs. I suspect the nuclear deal is dead for now, but we can hope that, given that I think behind the scenes, although there are some in America that want war because some officials, and some in Saudi Arabia and some in Israel, because they see it as a means of effecting regime change in Iran, They, I think, nonetheless, and most people in government, and you mentioned the Pentagon officials earlier, in America and certainly in Iran and elsewhere, don't want a full war to result. The problem is when you get into this cycle of escalation that America has absolutely initiated here, it's difficult to control. We look back to World War I and World War and other wars, and you can see exactly that scenario in progress.
Where can people read your excellent article, Charles?
It's on the American Herald Tribune site, but it's also on my Twitter feed. It's on there. You can have a look at that. It's a fairly long article, but it was written shortly after the incident happened, and it's covered so far pretty much what's going on. And you can. The problem is, though, George, when you read that article, you'll think, yeah, but this was obvious, this was obvious, this was obvious. And indeed, for anybody that's been paying attention, those results were obvious.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, not that many people pay attention until it's too late.
Exactly.
Charles Shoebridge, all-round expert, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let's take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Don't forget my anti-war rally in London on Friday. NoGulfWar.org is where you'll get details. NoGulfWar.org. It's on Friday, the 10th of January, 7 p.m., Saklat Vala Hall, Dominion Road in Southall, the nearest tube being Southall. There'll be an Eventbrite event put up on the internet for that. The poll is a record number so far. Virtually 4,000 people have voted. What should Boris Johnson do next? A, back Trump at 24%, that's up 1. B, oppose Trump, 48%, that's down 1. And C, remain neutral, 28%, no change. So half the people listening, watching and responding think we should either back Trump or remain neutral. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Now for the regular weekly feature on this day. On this day in 1952, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived in New York on the Queen Mary on a mission to renew the special relationship between Britain and the United States. That had certainly had its bumpy moments down the years, not least now with President Trump's government claiming Britain has not been supportive enough over the killing of General Soleimani. At the end of Churchill's visit, both governments issued a communique saying they had complete identity of aims in the Middle East. That was demonstrated most recently when in 2003, when the British Prime Minister Tony Blair supported George W. Bush's war against Iraq, and we all know how that ended. But by the way, just 4 years after that Churchill meeting in the United States, when they identified absolute identity of aims, the United States refused to support the British, French and Israeli invasion of Egypt in the Suez War. The so-called Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, appeared in court on this day in 1981. His reign of terror lasted from 1976 to 1981, in which time he murdered 13 women in the north of England and tried to murder 7 more. He said he was driven by messages from God. In May of 1981, he was driven to prison to begin a life sentence of no less than 30 years. He's still there, thankfully. Messages from God. Didn't Tony Blair and George W. Bush say they got those messages too before they killed a rather larger number of people in Iraq? Forgive me if you think that's tasteless. In 2001, a report on the former GP, that's general practitioner for US viewers and listeners, a family doctor, Dr. Harold Shipman, revealed that he had killed a minimum of 236 patients in England, possibly more than 300, by poisoning them. He was convicted and given a life sentence. 3 years later, in 2004, he was found hanging in his cell in Franklin Jail, County Durham. 300 of his patients poisoned by their family doctor. This was the week also in 1971 on New Year's Day when 66 spectators died at a football match between Rangers and Celtic at Ibrox Park in Glasgow. The tragedy happened on stairway 13 of the stadium. An inquiry later concluded that the crush was caused by the downward force of so many fans leaving at the same time. The traditional fixture has not been played on a New Year's Day since. It was also on New Year's Day in 1991 that serial killer Fred West, charged with 13 murders, was found hanged in his cell in Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. His wife Rose was later convicted of 9 murders, and she remains in prison. There's not a lot of joy here, historically, that's for sure, but I wish a very happy birthday to one of my favourite actors, Robert Duvall, who was born on this day in 1931. It was Duvall in Apocalypse Now, the Vietnam War epic, who spoke the classic line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory." Well, we now know it was actually the scent of defeat. Thanks to my friends Through the Glass, who produced on this day. The poll is still rattling on. You can vote on my Twitter feed, but let's take some calls. Bobby is an Iranian American and wants to talk about Iran, and he's most welcome. Bobby, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going, Mr. Galloway?
Oh, good. Nice to hear from you, sir. What would you like to say?
First off, I'd like to say I love your show. I just fell on it watching, RT, and
thank you.
You have very informative information on there, and you bring up excellent points.
Thanks, Bobby.
And I just wanted to add, there's a lot of questions that none of us can figure out what's happening, and we're a little confused by this whole mess, because in the beginning he said Trump said his whole campaign was based on ending endless wars.
Yeah.
And we're falling back into one that could be potentially catastrophic. So we're at a pretty much a stalemate in a situation where everybody is showboating on who's going to murder more than the other one. So it's a very sticky situation. And my main question is that Iran has been pretty much been forced to be the Iran that it is now because of pressure, in my opinion. If it was able to freely conduct its business like a country is supposed to, it wouldn't feel this type of this pressure that it needs to add to the outside of Iran. So I just don't understand how they cannot manage bypassing sanctions or maybe cutting deals with other countries. It seems like they have a lot of allies, but I feel like if they were able to do that, we wouldn't be in this situation.
Well, quite so, and Iran has been facing that, of course, much longer than the life of the Islamic Republic. I mentioned earlier the willful destruction of the democratic government of Mossadegh in 1953 by Britain and the United States in one of the foulest acts ever performed in the Middle East. And it seems that the United States in particular has a blind spot so far as Iran is concerned. The Europeans, including even the British, were quite happy opening up to Iran and Iran opening up to them, making the nuclear deal and so on. But it's your country, or the country in which you are a citizen, that is determined upon breaking Iran. And it's my case, and your call is a bit of a case in point, that this is actually bringing all the Iranians together. Am I right about that?
I mean, bringing them together is one thing. I mean, they have really no choice. Either they alienate the country and the media destroys them, which they're already doing an amazing job of, or they band together like a group has to.
Very interesting, Bobby, and very good of you to call. God save Iran, and I'm grateful to you for adding to the debate this evening. That was Bobby, an Iranian American, on the situation in Iran. Now, Caleb Maupin is my favorite American broadcaster. He's my colleague on RT America. He's a speaker, he's a writer, and he's a political analyst. And he joins me now. I don't know if it's on Skype. It is. Caleb, welcome again to the show. I'd like to wish you a Happy New Year, but it would seem rather incongruous in the circumstances. I saw pictures of anti-war activity all over the United States, very big demonstrations, very quick off the mark. How would you calibrate the state of public opinion on this whole crisis right now in the U.S.?
Well, there has been widespread denunciation of Trump's move to kill Qasem Soleimani, even from some of the most mainstream foreign policy voices in the United States. We recently saw the director of the Atlantic Council, certainly not an anti-imperialist organization, but we saw the director of the Atlantic Council speaking very, very harshly and arguing that this is going to hurt the influence of the United States in the Middle East in the long run. What's quite interesting and important to point out here is the way I see it, there is a long-standing division in U.S. politics between the military-industrial complex and the manufacturers and the CIA, intelligence, soft power apparatus, and big oil companies. And what has been very, very clear, if you listen to voices of that kind of big oil Eastern establishment in the United States that favors soft power, is that when Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, he basically ended any soft power opportunities for the United States in the Middle East, right? No one is going to trust the United States any longer. We remember the nuclear deal, and all over the world, people are looking at this and saying this is a result of the fact that Iran negotiated with the United States, made huge concessions to the United States at the negotiating table, and then was stabbed in the back. Right? And that the credibility of the United States as a negotiator, as a soft power entity, is over. It's very similar to the fallout, what happened in Libya, where Gaddafi had negotiated with the United States, and look how that ended up. And now Iran, that made huge concessions, has been completely stabbed in the back. This ruins the credibility of the United States in the region. Many mainstream voices in U.S. politics feel like this has gone too far.
Now, the Liberals have flip-flopped around in recent years, so-called progressives, even some leftists who've been denouncing Trump for not making war enough, particularly in Syria, but also in relation to Russia and the Ukraine and so on. They seem to have flopped again. The Liberati are out in full voice denouncing Trump for this action. How do we analyze that?
Well, there are different factions within America's economic ruling class. Trump is very closely aligned with certain interests. If you look at who's funding PragerU, which is one of the big YouTube channels that promotes Trump's ideas. If you look at who's funding Turning Points USA, which is a group promoting Donald Trump on college campuses, you'll see Bernie Marcus, who's the owner of Home Depot, which is a hardware store chain that's been putting small hardware stores across the United States out of business. If you go to any Home Depot, all the products on the shelves come from military contracting corporations. Who else is funding Trump activism in the United States? You've got Betsy DeVos and the DeVos Foundation. And Betsy DeVos Her brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater, the military contracting corporation. You've got Sheldon Adelson, who is a big supporter of the Likud party. And between all of these entities, and let me add the fracking companies that are having trouble paying back their loans, between all of them, they favor an escalation with Iran to shoot the oil prices up, to help Netanyahu, who's in trouble in Israel, and to make money for weapons manufacturers. Whereas the big oil establishment in the United States favored a different strategy. Under Obama, we saw a strategic oil price drop. We saw soft power negotiations. We saw kind of a building up of the reformist movement and elements in Iran that were more favorable to negotiations with the United States. It's a difference in strategy. That's essentially the difference here. The military-industrial complex likes to blow things up and have big wars and make lots of money. And the big oil apparatus favors a long-term strategy that's more managerial, pushing soft power and maneuvering to bring down geopolitical rivals of the United States. And when Trump carried out this move, he essentially ruined any hope of a soft power strategy against Iran. The richest of the rich in the United States see this as completely blowing to bits their strategy of gradually bringing down and fomenting unrest in Iran, maybe having a color revolution. They see that as completely over here. This is a battle of strategies, and the military-industrial complex, the Likud party in Israel, the fracking companies that want that oil price up as high as they possibly can, they seem to have won out here when Donald Trump took this move. Saudi Arabia is a big winner here too, right? Saudi Arabia at this point is seeing Trump take out, the leader of one of their biggest rivals. Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces that tried to kill Soleimani on so many occasions failed to do it, but now we've got the White House doing what Al-Qaeda and ISIS couldn't do. It's quite a dramatic moment here. But many of the supporters of Donald Trump, from the rank and file of some of the new right-wing movements that have emerged in the United States, aren't exactly thrilled with this. Sure, you have a flood of people who never even heard of Qasem Soleimani, who know nothing about this on Twitter, hearing that Trump killed some terrorist, and they're cheering, and all of that. But a lot of the more ideological folks within the Trump camp are very furious because they see this as a complete repudiation of what they voted for Trump for. Trump said America first. He ran on a platform of isolationism, and he seems to be on the brink of getting us into a whole new big war with a country that's much bigger than Iraq, much bigger than Libya, much stronger than Afghanistan. The implications of this are big.
Now, how does this affect, and how is it affected by the impeachment game of the Democrats in the House and now presumably one day in the Senate?
Well, the thing is, the impeachment forced Trump into a situation where he was extremely dependent on the support of the neoconservative wing of his own party. The Republican senators, most of which do not share Donald Trump's America First outlook, but rather have a neoconservative John Bolton, view of the world. Those folks are who Donald Trump is essentially groveling before and begging. If they have his back at an impeachment trial, he's fine. However, if he doesn't please them, if somehow some new information emerges or they just suddenly have a change of heart in the coming months, Trump will be out of office. So you can really interpret this move as Donald Trump kind of quaking in fear and trying to make sure he's got the Saudis on his side, trying to make sure he's got Likud in Israel on his side, and trying to make sure he's got the neocon wing of his own party that was not happy when he fired John Bolton, trying to line up their support as he faces an impeachment. You can interpret it very much that way. This is not a bold, heroic move, as some of Trump's supporters have liked to portray it. This is really Trump backing and kind of cowering in fear and desperately trying to hold on to the support of the neocons.
Now, in the Democratic camp, how will this all play out? As I saw it, only Bernie Sanders unequivocally denounced the Trump action. The others, flanneled about a bit on the one hand, but on the other. But Sanders was quite forthright, wasn't he?
Indeed, Sanders was very, very critical. And we have heard denunciations of the move from a lot of mainstream Democrats. However, they always, beforehand say, well, and they repeat all the allegations against Qasem Soleimani in U.S. media now, claiming that somehow he's responsible for the deaths of U.S. soldiers in Iraq when the IEDs were largely planted by Sunnis and extremists.
They never explain that. Every time I see that on Twitter, I say, what were these crimes, please? And nobody has ever responded.
Indeed, it's just taken as fact. Democrats, Republicans just repeat these allegations about Qasem Soleimani, someone who heroically battled ISIS, had a huge record of defending Christians in Syria, defending Christians in Iraq, defending religious minorities, fighting against the ISIL Wahhabi extremist element. Somehow they're trying to paint him as if he's another bin Laden. But the reality is that's simply not the case. What is interesting also is that, in this age in the United States where, on our university campuses, young people are being taught that there is no truth, that right and wrong are all just kind of a matter of opinion, that this age of pessimism where people are basically being told to not be optimistic about the future. If you look at the life of Qasem Soleimani, and I'm not going to endorse everything he ever said or did, but if you look at his life, he very much incarnates a lot of the values that Americans are longing for: honor, sacrifice, martyrdom, martial virtue, these kind of values that are missing in U.S. society as we enter this age of postmodernism. It's quite interesting to see that now they are trying to rewrite history and make him into the kind of people he fought against. Let's remember this. Qasem Soleimani saved the lives of thousands of Christians in Syria. He saved the lives of thousands of Christians in Iraq. I mean, he was very much, a champion for people that were downtrodden and oppressed. He also, apparently, from what I understand, at different points was willing to sit down with the United States and cooperate with them in places like Afghanistan, in Iraq, immediately after the U.S. invasion. So they're just completely rewriting the record here and giving Saudi Arabia, a country that is the homeland of Osama bin Laden, where the bin Laden family is one of the richest, has a state monopoly on construction, basically giving them a blank pass, overlooking the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report, and then trying to rewrite all the history of the Middle East to make Qasem Soleimani and the Islamic Republic of Iran responsible for the crimes of the people that they have fought against.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some breaking news, Caleb. In the last few minutes, Donald Trump has said the U.S. could act disproportionately if Iran targets any American person or target in revenge for the killing of Soleimani. The U.S. president tweeted, of course, after Tehran vowed to avenge the death of the general. Trump wrote, "These media posts will serve as notification to the United States Congress that should Iran strike any U.S. person or target, the U.S. will quickly and fully strike back, and perhaps in a disproportionate manner. Such legal notice is not required, but is given nevertheless." What do you think he means by that, Caleb?
Well, this sounds like another cowardly statement from a man who realizes that when Iran responds, which they most likely will, there will be thousands of people, not just all over the world, but there will be millions of people in the United States who won't blame Iran for it, but will blame Trump for, does he really expect that he can kill the top general, the hero of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and not get a response? And there are going to be many people who, whatever response Iran gives, won't just say, oh, Iran is evil, but will actually blame Donald Trump for escalating the situation completely unnecessarily and putting American lives in danger. And I think he realizes that, and he's trying to hold off, trying to stop the tidal wave or the avalanche that he himself started. This is the sorcerer's apprentice, losing control of his own creation.
Well, I think that's a good point to end it. Brilliant words. Thank you very much, Caleb Maupin, writer, analyst, speaker, very good speaker too, and my colleague at RT America. I'm on RT America every day, by the way, Monday to Friday at 5 o'clock London time with Manila Chan on the In Question program. The poll is not yet updated. I'll bring it to you when it is, but the volume of emails and so on is quite enormous. Dennis says, I heard Keir Starmer say that the Remain issue is dead in the water. When did he have this Damascene conversion? As far as I recall, all of 3 weeks ago, he was twisting Jeremy Corbyn's arm and forcing him to promise an undeliverable new referendum. Well, more fool Corbyn for allowing him to twist his arm, Dennis. Happy New Year, George, though current events may portend otherwise. What do you think is behind the president's threat against 52 target sites, to include cultural sites, presumably mosques? Of course, the provisions of justice are routinely breached, but the Geneva Convention, doesn't that immediately isolate the allies, says Will in Singapore. He asks, P.S., how do you take your tea? Often. Black. No sugar. Thanks, Will. Gokhan from Sydney, Australia, says, I'd just like to say, as much as Iran wants to hit the US back, it really can't do much more than what it has been doing to the US before. Another thing is that Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of protesters during the riots when Iran raised fuel prices. The official figure of the dead was 300 plus, but later people were saying the number of dead was roughly 1,500. I don't understand how people can adore this general so much. If I was Persian living in Iran, I would resent this man so much. I do understand the impact he had on ISIS, and for that I give him credit. Well, looking at the streets of Iran today, two things, Gokhan, strike me. The first is that any idea of regime change is moonshine. This is a regime that is very firmly in the saddle, whatever you or I think of it. And secondly, the idea, as Trump himself and Pompeo said, that the Iranians would be secretly glad for the killing of Soleimani is quite obvious nonsense. Tony says, February the 11th is the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. They may wait until then. David in Birmingham says, Tehran has always been a jewel in the crown. Aim for the US. I hope cool heads prevail in this situation, but I doubt if this dangerous theatre will be anything cool. You and me both. George Reed in Clackmannan says, I've not always agreed with you, but your analysis on Iran is spot on. Yet again, this is about oil. America is a huge consumer, slavering at Iran's oil resources. The US wants to provoke a war so it can again seize hold free of that country's oil reserves. They interfered in 1953, and here they are doing the same again. Are you the George Reed from Clackmannan? If so, I send you my greetings and fond memories of our time together in Geneva, I think it was. Dear George, who's been praying and begging for the US to attack Iran for years? Whose political career is now hanging by a thread? Who will be cheering at this news? Is it really possible that Netanyahu has had nothing to do with motivating the strike against Soleimani? By the way, we've learned this week that Ghislaine Maxwell is hiding in Israel. Join the dots. Watch you every week. No other UK media gets closed. All the best, Paul in London. Thanks for that, Paul. Now, all of the foregoing is true, but that doesn't mean it's an Israeli decision. The tail never wags the dog. The dog is the United States. Israel is the tail. The poll is closing it's closed now at 5,000 votes. 24% of you think we should back Trump here in Britain. 47% of you think we should oppose Trump, and 29% of you think we should remain neutral. There were 5,263 votes cast. Grumbleweed says on Twitter, Boris should appeal directly to Iran, not to overreact, just like we didn't over the Russian nerve gas. We might have some influence with Iran, as we're still in the non-proliferation nuclear deal, therefore not imposing extra sanctions. And Phil says he won't oppose. That's why they backed him to win the leadership. Funny how it all pans out in the end. 2 liars elected, and the war for oil continues. And Useful Idiot says, as an American, I'd appreciate Bojo's help in arresting Trump and holding him in Belmarsh prison indefinitely. It appears that international laws do not matter anymore. And Steve says, we already have warships doing escort duty. They'll be as useful as a Madison Avenue escort if the balloon goes up. Will Carpenter says, my response, a prince is also much respected, but he is either a true friend or a downright enemy. In other words, when he declares himself without any reservation in favor of one party against the other, this will always be more favorable than remaining neutral. A quote from Machiavelli. Of course, Phil says we have enough problems. Boris should do the minimum to support the USA and keep the hell out of it thereafter. And Terry Sparrow says, nobody is defending Soleimani as a saint, far from it. However, I think the USA should finally accept that they can't have the whole planet in their image. Thanks for that, Terry, and I'll try to get through some of the other hundreds of messages that have been brought to me in the course of the show. But the final hour will be mainly your calls. So let's hear the news with Emily Horn.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Hundreds of thousands of mourners have taken to the streets in Iran as the remains of Qasem Soleimani are brought home. In the city of Avaz, people beat their chests and chanted "Death to America" following the death of the Iranian general. Soleimani was the architect of Iran's sphere of influence across the Middle East, and he was considered to be the country's second most powerful man. His assassination is marking a significant escalation between Iran and the U.S. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who had a close personal relationship with Soleimani, warned of severe revenge for the attack. Analysts now say Iran might pursue cyber attacks against the United States, traditional attacks on U.S. targets or interests in the Middle East. President Trump, who authorized the assault, an option refused by both Presidents Bush and Obama as too risky, says the U.S. is ready to strike 52 sites important to Iran and the Iranian culture. The president added that targets identified represented 52 Americans who were held hostage in Iran from late 1979 after they were taken from the U.S. Embassy. Iran's foreign minister has responded on Twitter, saying that the killing of Soleimani was a breach of international law and that any targeting of cultural sites would constitute a war crime. Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab is now urging Iran to take a diplomatic route to reduce tensions with the West and come in from the international cold. Raab has told the BBC the U.S. has a right to exercise self-defense. After its comprehensive defeat in the British general election, the Labour Party will now begin the process of choosing a new leader. Well, 5 candidates have so far entered the race to succeed Jeremy Corbyn. 2 of them say that the public did not trust Labour to deliver on many of its election commitments. The former shadow Brexit secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, who is the favourite, says its manifesto was overloaded and hampered Labour's ability to present itself as a force for good and a force for change. Jess Phillips says Labour lost trust on some of the basics, such as its broadband pledge to deliver free, high-speed broadband to every home. Shadow Business Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey, one of the favorites, is expected to officially declare her candidacy in the coming days. And Austria's foreign ministry has been targeted by a cyber attack that is suspected to have been conducted by another country. While the ministry said the seriousness of the attack suggested it might have been carried out by a state actor. The hack started on Saturday night, and experts warn it could continue for several days. The foreign ministry says it was recognized very quickly and countermeasures were taken immediately. Next, 6 German tourists have been killed and 11 injured in the Italian Alps when a car crashed into them. A suspected drunk driver collided with the group of young people in the town of Lüdeck in South Tyrol, a popular skiing destination. Reports suggested they had left a nightclub and were waiting to get a bus when the car then struck them. The driver of the car, a man in his late 20s, was arrested and is currently in hospital. Next, raging bushfires in Australia have turned the sky bright orange over Auckland in New Zealand, more than 1,200 miles away. People have also reported breathing difficulties caused by the smoke from the devastating blazes. A witness to the eerie spectacle has described it as apocalyptic. Hours before the sun was due to set, street lights in Auckland were turned on early and motorists were forced to use headlights because the plumes of smoke made the skies so dark. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who is being criticised for his responses to the emergency, is warning that the devastating bushfires raging in the country may go on for months. At least 24 people have died since the fires began, and air quality in the capital was this weekend rated the worst in the world. And finally, it's been more than 2 years since the first allegations of sexual misconduct against Hollywood movie mogul Harvey Weinstein became public. And tomorrow, for the first time, he will find himself in a criminal court standing trial for his alleged crimes. The former Miramar studio boss is accused of 5 sex crimes, including rape and sexual assault against 2 women. If convicted, he could face a life sentence. Actress Rosanna Arquette will be in court to support his alleged victims. She has accused Weinstein of derailing her career after she resisted his advances and was one of the dozens of women to come forward and tell her story. Weinstein, who has been seen using a Zimmer frame in recent weeks, has pleaded not guilty to all charges and was freed on a $1 million bail, recently increased to $5 million. It's understood his lawyers will argue that all of the encounters were consensual. Well, that's all for Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, normally at this time, I'm joined by Adam Gary, hashtag Ask Adam. Adam has drawn stumps and retired to the pavilion. Musical differences have sundered us, but I want to say how much I enjoyed working with him these last 28 weeks. He's been with us right from the start. Indeed, Adam may be the only man on the planet who has listened to every single episode of the mother of all talk shows since 2006, January of 2006, now 14 years ago. And I know that he's listening and maybe even watching also tonight. So I want to thank him for that. I'm glad there is no acrimony between us, just, as I say, creative, musical differences. I don't know if we'll try to replace him. Maybe the cleverest woman in England might step forward. Any volunteers, let us know. Now, I've got lots of calls, but I need to read some of this social media. Jeffrey never called in Glasgow, the gutless coward. He wasn't hard enough after all. Stuart in West London says, I believe the last thing Trump and his support base want coming up to the 2020 presidential elections is another devastating war in the Middle East. I say that President Trump is being held hostage by the military-industrial complex and the deep state. Not so, Stuart. The deep state tried to stop him doing this. We can't keep developing our conspiracy theories to exculpate Donald Trump. He did this. He chose this option. The deep state advised him against it, but he did it anyway. And whether or not he wants a devastating war in the Middle East, he's going to now get one. Kath says, thanks for telling everything like it is. Thank you, Kath. Billy from Islington, Billy, you get my drift, from Islington, says, Mr. Galloway, as a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and an ardent Remainer, I was a bit shocked to see you drinking your tea out of a Union Jack mug last Sunday. I have to question your loyalty to the anti-imperialist cause. It was only a joke, Billy, and quickly replaced. But you keep waving yours. Tom says, hello, well, not only has Trump acted like a complete fool with Iran, apparently, according to some recent news, his government has also recently upped the sanctions on Cuba. Is this man trying to annoy and aggravate everyone in the world? Well, that's already happened, I think, Tom. Constance says American foreign policy actions are beginning to resemble Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip, murder incorporated. And Stephen McCandless says, do nice people believe in revenge? Don't go that low, Iran, please. My goodness, Steve, what do you think they are? Saints. Zoxilix says in capital letters, it's always a giveaway, Iran is a false flag attack. Yeah, right. David says, US and Iran situation, not our circus, not our clowns. We have our own house to put in order. Keep well out of it. And Summer Winds says, the reckless move wasn't Trump killing Soleimani. The reckless move was Soleimani attacking a United States embassy. Except he didn't, but don't let the facts get in the way. You'll see just what the reckless move was in the next days and weeks. Jane A. says, I think Bojo will do a Theresa May and hide. And Omar says, opposing Trump is the only solution to peaceful coexistence in the Middle East. When has there ever been peaceful coexistence in the Middle East, Omar? Innocent says, if he does denounce the violence, Trump, Boris, that is, his approval ratings would shoot through the ceiling. If he does, it'll be a win-win situation for all. And Tim says, I think he should seriously consider a week in the Maldives. It's lovely at this time of the year. Wish I could have a week in the Maldives, Tim. And Joss says UK isn't neutral with Julian Assange, so why would they start now? And Stuart Brennan says, Boris the Spider Johnson should condemn the US murder of Soleimani, but he will not, simply because the UK and USA are tied together by economic and military strings. War crimes are their business. Let's hear from Angelo in Salford, in Manchester. Go ahead, Angelo.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Okay, mate?
Yeah, good.
Hi,
nice to hear from you. Go on.
And you, yeah, I've seen the stick that you've had to go through over the years just because, your opinion didn't suit their narrative. You was a friend of Saddam Hussein. You said to people, look, don't go to war. We had the Pope, one of the best popes, John Paul, say don't go to war. Years later, millions of people dead, children, innocent people, all for a false thing. No weapons of mass destruction, no chemicals, no even missiles with the capabilities to be a threat. Now, we've been sold this lie and lie again. Now, the only reason Iran is more of a threat is because we bought this kind of fear-factoring, fear-mongering again. Oh, they have an air force. Right, okay. It's not bigger than the US military, my friend. They do not have the same amount of aircraft that can detonate bombs on you. 20, 30 years ago, the Americans were working on the B-32 bomber, a stealth bomber, going over radar with diesel covered in it. People thought it was UFOs. Right, if that was happening 30, 40 years ago, my friend, what do you think they've got up their sleeve now? Okay.
Well, there's no doubt, Angelo. Let me correct one thing.
Yeah, okay.
I met Saddam Hussein twice in my life. Once for 50 seconds with 50 other people, and on the second last occasion in August of 2002, when I successfully appealed to him to allow the arms inspectors back into Iraq.
Right,
more fool me and more fool him for agreeing with what I had to say. So I was not a friend of Saddam Hussein, although that allegation doesn't quite have the sting it used to have, given what's happened in Iraq since Britain and America overthrew him. But the point that you're making is an obvious one. The United States is enormously more powerful than Iran, but Iran is enormously more powerful than any of the wars that America has fought since the Second World War. Much more powerful than Vietnam, much more powerful than Korea, much more powerful than Afghanistan, than Iraq, any of the places that the US has bombed and missiled. Iran has the ability to punch back, and it has the motivation to do so. And it doesn't have to do much to bring about incalculable damage. It only has to set the Straits of Hormuz on fire, which it can do in an instant, and no oil will pass through it. And that's a quarter nearly of the oil that is needed in the world, particularly in the European economies. It only has to land 6 missiles on the oil refinery capacity of Saudi Arabia, and there'll be no more exports from Saudi Arabia. Ditto the Emirates, ditto Qatar. They can do all of that. That's my point.
Yeah, but my point is that's close proximity, fighting back, right? They will probably attack the Americans like a chessboard, the pawns being the weakest pieces. So borders that are supporting that are heavy military base by US, have UK embassies, American embassies, they'll take these out first. But what I'm saying to you... That
is a possibility. I don't agree with it, but Charles,
I don't agree
Charles seemed to be agreeing with you. But that would look sneaky, you see. I don't believe that Iran will lose its dignity by having proxies landing small arms on unimportant American targets. I believe that Iran will choose a prestige American target and directly hit it itself. That's my analysis. Go on.
My opinion, and it's a researched opinion, right? There's been talk about the next war will be between the Americans and the Iranians. So I said, let me go on YouTube, and it wasn't just some Tom, Dick and Harry talking about it, it was official data, right? They compared weapon for weapon, plane for plane, ship for ship, blah, blah, blah. If Iran even thinks about sending a nuclear weapon, it will get him...
No, they don't have... Angelo, they don't have nuclear weapons, so park that.
No, but there's talk that they
no, there's no talk. Well, this is the problem with people whose idea of research is YouTube. Iran has no nuclear weapons. Angelo, Iran has no nuclear weapons. Iran has no... No, because you're talking nonsense. Iraq has no nuclear weapons. Angelo, stop talking for a minute, and I'll let you back in. Iran has no nuclear weapons. This is attested to by every government in the world. But it does have a significant ballistic missile capability, capable of doing dramatic damage in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, even in Israel, if they decided to do so. That they do have. Go ahead, Angelo.
No, hand on heart, right? I'll go before reading this, and you know this quote, and you can't deny this quote, right? You can't fight a ghost, mate. It's invisible, right? And when we went to a war with Iraq, what did a Muslim quote once say? Yeah? You attack us from the sky, you don't fight on the ground, right? You are cowards. We enjoy death more than life itself.
Well, I don't know who said that, but I'm cutting you off now. I'm cutting you off now because a little knowledge is dangerous, and you're definitely in possession of a little knowledge. It is undoubtedly the case that one option open to Iran is irregular guerrilla action, maybe by proxies, in far-off places in Kenya or Argentina or around the world where U.S. interests and assets proliferate. That is one option open to Iran. But that would lack the dignity of Iran officially striking an American target in the region in retaliation. I believe that's what they will choose. Now, of course, that will invite massive American further retaliation. But one point that you made is correct. Iran and Iranians are well ready to die. for them dying, fighting the United States of America in defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a matter of regret, but of celebration. Be careful if you're taking on a man who not only has nothing to lose, but is looking forward to losing even their life. Now, it says here I must plug the podcast. You can catch up on the mother of all talk shows anytime, whenever you like. You simply download Moats Podcast, that's hashtag MOATS, via your favorite podcast app, Anchor.fm, Spotify, and Google Play. I know nothing, they lost me at podcast. I know nothing about these things, but my wife knows everything about them. And apparently, the podcasts are going like hot cakes. So if you want the podcast, that's how you do it. You download the hashtag Moats Podcast on Anchor.fm, Spotify, and Google Play. Let's go to Seattle and hear from Danny. Go ahead, Danny.
Hey, hello, George.
Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Well, I'm calling about just the situation. I just feel so upset watching Trump the last few weeks with the evangelicals praying over him and saying he's Jesus. I don't know. It's just crazy.
I'll tell you what I saw, Danny. I saw a group of evangelicals literally quivering as they caressed him. And he stood in the middle of them, beaming broadly, looking like a big palooka that is being treated like Jesus. It makes you wonder, some of the people in the United States. I had 7 death threats from the United States on my Facebook messages that I opened last night. There are a lot of nutters in your country, Danny.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right, Georgia. I mean, I live in the state of Washington, which you may know is quite liberal.
Yeah.
At least on the west side, there's a mountain range in the middle, and on the east side we have the crazy Representative Shea, who's running, who's waiting to create some sort of biblical army to take on the gay people and all the other sort of stereotypical nonsense.
Yeah.
But I regret.
They're all mad for Trump, but I mean, there's a number of them, a lot of them, but not that many. The vast majority of U.S. citizens are not like that. Some of Trump's own base that believed him when he said he wouldn't start any new wars, now that he started one, must be in danger of deserting him, don't you think?
Well, I think at least the people on the fringes, that aren't so embedded, but some are pretty fanatical. I agree with your assessment, though, that it's most Americans, are hardworking people who just want to get by. Unfortunately, they've turned us into a sort of a new feudalism state where young people. I'm 72 years old, George.
You don't sound it, mate.
I was a labor union guy. I had a job for 25 years where I went to work every day, 8 hours a day. And so this area is gone in America. The labor unions have been decimated, and they're starting to come back with the help of Senator Sanders in a lot of cases, who's been walking a lot of picket lines for 50 years. But he's not a newcomer.
This might help, Danny, this might help Bernie, don't you think?
Can you say that again, George?
Yeah, what Trump has done may very well help Bernie as the only clearly anti-war candidate running for the nomination, and one who is brave enough to articulate the facts as he did immediately in the aftermath of this attack. American people might just be looking for a president that really means it when he says he's against endless, useless, pointless, bloody, terrifically expensive wars.
You're exactly right, George. And I think you're right. It might help the Democrat that gets nominated. I hope it's Bernie Sanders. I think Biden, if Biden is nominated, he will probably be, Trump will make him look like a circus dog. And this, it's just bad. But I'm hoping that what comes out of this also is a peace movement in the United States, where there was quite a few large marches, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, there
yesterday,
were. I saw them. They were
Chicago.
big. They were big. Chicago was massive.
Yes, and also in Los Angeles, Jimmy Dore was speaking, and also Abby Martin was there, and her partner, I can forget his name right now, but
Mike, he's wonderful. Mike is a wonderful, wonderful guy.
In fact, I think he organized the march, but
yeah.
But anyways, I work for I'm retired. I've been retired for some time. I have a small piece of property, which I live on. I'm very lucky. And I volunteer, and I do social media for some progressive organizations here in the state.
Well, God bless you. God bless you, Danny. God bless all those that were on those demonstrations so quickly in the United States. And, of course, Mike and Abby, perhaps most especially, and Jimmy Dore, too. Thank you very much indeed. Scott says, Trump thinks he's playing a computer game. And Biker Wolfie says, Johnson will do as he's told, just like the Trump puppet he is. And Dr. Kozik says, Boris should step down and name you as his successor. Thank you, Doctor. Topic-wise, anyone who sincerely thinks intervention in the Middle East won't backfire is stupid and shouldn't come anywhere near a governing position. Either that or he's a Raytheon shareholder. That is the tweet of the night, Dr. Dord Kozik. Scott Gray says, doesn't matter what Boris thinks, he will do whatever he's told by the USA like a good little boy. And Wardare says, so many people are detached from reality. We're becoming American. Laugh and joke about the terrible things we do to other nations. Imperialism reinvigorated and actually acceptable to so many. I'm not sure what Boris Johnson says or does matters anymore. Let's take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Kezai says, unfortunately, Boris cannot afford to oppose thin-skinned Trump pre-UK-USA trade deal talks. They already have the UK over the barrel anyway. However, opposing Trump would be tantamount to over the barrel, and I can't read the rest. But it's funny, I just can't read it. Leonard says, I pressed the wrong button in your poll. I was aiming to oppose Trump, but I fumbled and pressed support. So one more vote for oppose, one less for support. Sorry. Thank God your finger's not on the trigger. Let's hear from Stephen in Paris. Go ahead, Stephen.
Good evening, George, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, my friend. Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Well, in fact, it's the first time I've called a radio show, but I'm so outraged by what happened to this assassination that I just had to call.
Welcome. Go ahead.
Well, the thing is, I have family members who served in Iraq in 2003, and they said that it was the biggest mistake. It was a complete mess, destroyed a country, and so I actually supported Trump in 2016 because I thought he was going to get out of the Middle East. And so...
Well, you had a right to do so because he said he would.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, great, this is a guy's good. But But I have a feeling as well is that both Saudi Arabia and Israel also want this war as well.
Of course they do, yeah. Very much so. It's a very useful distraction for Netanyahu, who's facing the jail. And Saudi Arabia exists to confront Iran and its blind sectarian Wahhabist insanity is its raison d'etre.
Of course, but like today I listened to a show by Nigel Farage, and I was surprised that Nigel Farage supported this action, in fact. And he said, well,
I think he'll support anything Donald Trump says or does now.
And that disgusts me as well, because I supported him for a while. And he was saying, well, this is a terrible country.
He's over, Stephen. He's very last year.
I hope so, because he was saying that, for example, he said, for example, this is a terrible country, he has got no human rights, the journalists are locked up, people get heads chopped off, and I'm thinking, well, Saudi Arabia did the same thing. And we put
it. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, you get crucified, then you get your head chopped off.
Yeah, I know.
Even when you're a kid, 16-year-old.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. So I mean, I don't really have, I can't really add anything new to what you said.
To hear from you. Keep your head down in Paris, Steve. There's a lot going on there.
Oh yeah.
Are you living there? Are you living there?
Yeah, I live around the corner from the massacre that happened here a few years ago.
The Bataclan.
Yeah, I live around the corner from there.
Dear.
So I mean, I have nothing really to add to the conversation. I just am outraged by this. For me, it's an act of war.
Stephen, it's one of the best calls of the night. Don't worry about that, son. Don't be a stranger. Thanks. Let's hear from Nicola in Swindon. Go ahead, Nicola.
Good afternoon to you, George. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Yes.
Well, my thoughts is that England or Great Britain should keep well out of this. This is between Trump and Iran. We should not get involved. We should perhaps mediate if things get out of hand, but we certainly shouldn't be sending troops there. We need to get our people out, and we need to sort of keep a neutral attitude on this at the moment.
If I was Boris Johnson, if I was not Boris Johnson, but if I was the Prime Minister, I would fly to Iran immediately to mediate.
As negotiator?
Yeah, to mediate, yeah.
Yes, exactly. That's what I think so. Now, another thing, George, just a minute. A friend of mine would love to be your assistant on the show. She's been trying to get hold of you. She's a friend of ours. You know who I mean. You know Tina. She's been trying to get through to you.
I think we're, with all respect to her, I think we're looking for someone who is on the other side of politics for me. As you saw from the poll numbers, Nicola, though a lot of you had no appreciation of this, half of our listeners either want to remain neutral in this affair or to back Trump. A quarter of us wanted to back Trump, and a quarter of us wanted to remain neutral. So you see, a very significant number of our viewers and listeners are not left-wing people like you and Tina. And so it's far better if I can get a wingman or woman who has quite different, radically different politics from me. Otherwise, it can become boring, you see. It becomes mono. We want stereo. Thanks, Nicola,
I think you're missing an opportunity, but thanks, George.
Thanks for that. Dennis is in Brooklyn. Let's hear from him. Dennis, welcome.
Hello, George. How are you?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thanks for calling. Go on.
Thank you so much for having me. I love your show so much.
Thank you.
I have a question. I was just so confused why Trump would okay this move now, because, and I don't like Trump, believe me, I'm too far to the left for that. But, any American president in the land of neocon bill that doesn't bomb other countries for 3 years going, okay, I can ride with that. So just when the impeachment seemed to be like he survived the worst of the worst, it seemed like his poll ratings had gone up a little bit. It seemed like the Democrats looked bad. It's almost like, why would Assad have gassed his own people in Duma just at the point when the U.S. was about to pull out of there and were defeated? Why would Trump do this now? And Caleb added some answer to that for me, that maybe it's the pressure from the military-industrial guys. I know the New York Times had an article that the military-industrial complex is heavily pushing for the impeachment or holding it over Trump's head. So, I don't know. Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, that's what we used to call, Dennis, what we used to call the $64,000 question when $64,000 was worth rather more than it is today. No one can really answer that. It is inexplicable. It was inexplicable to the military officials who put the option in front of him, because not only had he declined that option back in June when the American drone was shot down, but George W. Bush had turned it down when it was put before him. Barack Obama had turned it down when it was put before him. That shows how long the murder of Soleimani has been premeditated. For those who are balking at my use of the word murder, it's the clearest case of murder you could possibly get. It is a premeditated, unlawful killing of a human being, moreover a diplomat on diplomatic business in a second country. So I can't answer that. Caleb gave something of an answer. I never believe that these answers wholly explain things. He may have imagined that it would divert all attention from the impeachment and might be a vote winner. I suspect it's going to be neither. It's going to re-energize the impeachment issue once the full awfulness of what is to come plays out, and it will almost certainly lose him votes, not win them. Anyone who loves the killing of brown-skinned people, preferably in foreign streets, but in your own streets will do, was already voting for Donald Trump. He hasn't won anybody by this action that wasn't already voting for him, but I suspect he may well have lost a considerable number of those that might have. Last word to you, Dennis.
Thank you. I would just say that I wonder if even maybe he wasn't paying attention to who the target was, that maybe he's near the golf course. They gave him this list. And I'm not trying to defend the man. I don't understand at this point in time why he would do such a drastic act. I could see if he was being impeached and he wanted a diversion. It's just beyond me right now, George.
Wag the Dog. You remember that film with Al Pacino? You create a foreign war, even a mythical one. Dennis in Brooklyn, thanks for the call. Paul in Nottingham in England. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, good evening, George, and a very happy New Year to you, brother.
Thank you, my friend.
Lovely. George, I'll start off by saying that, Trump, for the last few years have been talking about regime change in Iran. They know they'll never, ever achieve that. Iran's got a religious leadership, and that'd be like, trying to remove the Pope from the Vatican.
Yeah.
They've got absolutely no chance in doing that. Now, however, they're saying we're not looking for regime change. And yet, to murder, and I'd call it murder, not killing, but murder, to murder, an Iranian top general is asking for trouble, George. This is how the Americans behave. Yeah, if that was any other country doing it, Trump would be the first one to say, "Oh, you don't do that. That's how dictatorships behave."
Look, can you? If Soleimani was the number 2 man in Iran, who's the number 2 man in the United States? Mike Pence, the vice president.
I was going to say Petraeus.
Well, no. If a foreign state murdered the vice president of the United States. As a matter of fact, Soleimani was much more important than Mike Pence. But if that happened, I mean, the whole world would go to war to get justice for that. But there are so many American people and many people here in Britain don't actually look at it that way.
Yes, they don't, George. And yet, like you said earlier, murdering brown-skinned people in foreign lands.
A lot of them like that. Yeah, a lot of them like that.
It's like the Israelis. When an Israeli soldier dies, they go out their way on the BBC and mainstream news channels like Sky, and say, they'll describe it as, an RDF soldier murdered. But when it's a Palestinian, a Syrian, or anybody else, they're being killed.
Paul, the
sanitize
the blood of some people is much more valuable than the blood of others. Thanks a lot for that, Paul, in Nottingham. Of course, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to approach a crisis like this. Piers Morgan, my old friend, has come up with an imaginative one. He's emailed the show, and it's worth hearing. George, surely any response by Iran will be playing into the hands of the US. A response would open the door to full-scale retaliation by the US, which is exactly what they want. The best response Iran could have now is a political response rather than an act of aggression. Take legal action against the US and complain through the UN. There will be many reprisals from rogue operatives across the globe. And if the official state response from Iran is nothing, it would make the US look neutered and pathetic. What more could Iran ask? Regards, Piers Morgan. And Madeleine de Maupin is like that wee guy in There Will Be Blood. Mercy. I don't know what that means. I worked for Raytheon, says David, and I can testify to the individualistic, selfish nature of the rat race. That people are being killed, including innocent people, means nothing to those who need to get ahead of the competition. Trump has demonstrated his contempt for peace. Thank you for all you're doing and your passionate support for democracy and freedom of speech. Thank you for that, David. Now, I said Leonard's one was very funny. Kay's was very funny, but I couldn't possibly read it out. Woody Woodpecker says Trump should watch the unified defiance on the streets of Iran. Stop and think before he speaks on the subject again. Abdul is on the line in Seattle. Lots of US calls tonight, and I'm glad for that. Abdul, go ahead.
Hey, Mr. Galloway, how you doing?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you for calling. What would you like to say?
I just wanted to add some additional comments on the Iran situation.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're mentioning like legal action Iran can take. What would legal action like? What would that translate to? Like, what would that be? Like UN, like writing letters to
it wasn't me. It was Piers Morgan, who's a very big television and journalist guy here in England and also in America too. I suppose what they could do, they could sue the United States government in the courts in Iraq, for example, and they could try to go to the International Criminal Court. The United States refuses to recognize that, but the court could still hear the case if a state actor brought it, and that would be, in this case, Iran. They could ask the Security Council to denounce the murder, though the United States and maybe others would veto that. I don't personally see it as a runner, but Piers is positing it as an alternative to doing something that will bring overwhelming violence back from the United States. So I'm sure it's worth thinking of. Abdul, what's your view? Is it a proportionate response to react to the murder of the second man in your state to begin a legal action in the courts in Baghdad?
I think legal action is not going to work because if you kind of just look at the climate of the situation, the nuclear deal being pulled off the table last year, and now this escalation, it kind of seemed like a battle is inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say that the ripping up of the nuclear deal by Donald Trump is the real basis of all this crisis. Everything was working, and Trump, for reasons of his own, decided to kick over the table at which this treaty had been reached, irrespective of all of his allies opposing him, and everything that has happened has flowed ineluctably from that.
Yeah, I think Trump is just like he's just like a manager at McDonald's. You know, I feel like U.S. wanted war with Iran for a long time, and Trump is just the guy to do it at this time in history.
I suspect your country will come to regret it. Abdul in Seattle, thanks for that. Chris is in Colchester in England. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the implications by saying this is an act for Israel, and I know those implications don't exist if you say it's for oil or for Saudi Arabia. But I think we can't beat around the bush. Israel was briefed before Congress about this.
They didn't tell Boris Johnson or their own Congress, but they did tell Netanyahu.
Yeah, and Soleimani was on the Israeli hit list. And when Trump scrapped the Iran deal, Netanyahu in the recent election, he was boasting about getting Trump to scrap it.
Sure.
And he's got very close ties to the family with Kushner.
Sure.
He slept in Jared Kushner's bed when he stays at the family. So, you know, this is not Jewish people; it's a state. So we shouldn't.
No, I don't beat about the bush, Chris. I just insist that we beat around the right bush. And my point was earlier that, of course, Israel has something to gain from this act. Israel is very happy about this act. As you say, Israel was consulted about this act. But that doesn't mean it was done for Israel. It's actually much closer to home. It was done, in particular, this confrontation with Iran is done for many reasons, one of which is Israel, another of which is Saudi Arabia and the other satrapies around the Persian Gulf. But the main reason it's done, as Caleb Maupin pointed out earlier, is for domestic American reasons. All I say is Israel and the United States are close, very close, couldn't be closer, but one of them is a tail and the other is the dog. And those who insist that Israel is wagging the dog are making a mistake, and it leads into some dark places. But thanks for your call. Dave is in Warsaw, and he wants to talk about this too. Dave, go ahead. Dave, are you there?
Hey, George.
Go ahead, but we're not hearing you very well. Do try. Go ahead.
Yeah, George, just calling to say that.
Apparently I've not got Dave yet. Let me read more of the social media. Dean Sinclair says Johnson needs to remain neutral. He doesn't yet want to back someone as volatile as Trump, knowing he could do something outrageous at any moment. Also, my preference is for us not to interfere in the Middle East anyway. But also, we can't oppose a man who we are looking to for an almighty trade deal. And James in Dundee says, I know you're always right, but the old firm last met on New Year's Day in 2010-11 and 1994 before that. So the Ibrox disaster has nothing to do with the game not being played on New Year's Day. Jamesy, that's well pointed out. And you'll recall, if you play it back, I issued the prophylactic that the On This Day was compiled by somebody else and not for me. And that somebody else is even now being taken out of the building and relieved of their responsibilities. Tony says, following the call from Bobby, the Iranian-American gentleman, is it the case that Trump, like Corbyn, has simply been worn down by the clique that surrounds him? Corbyn was anti-EU and was turned. Trump stood on the promise to stay out of conflicts and then does this. How difficult is it to lead and be your own man? Well, not for me, Tony. I wouldn't think it was worth being the leader if I wasn't actually doing the leading. Dave is on the line now from Warsaw. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, George, how are you?
Good. Nice to hear from you, sir.
Thank you. George, I got to say, when I turn on the mainstream media in the States, I feel like I'm living in the upside down. When it comes to...
You and me both. Parallel universe.
Yeah, when it comes to Soleimani, everything I see tells me that he's a terrorist and that he's a bad guy. Meanwhile, he was the #1 fighter of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq.
Exactly.
And the funny part is...
If it wasn't for him, Syria and Iraq would not exist. as states right now, and they'd all be speaking ISIS.
Yes, and I'm being told that he's the terrorist. Meanwhile, our number one ally in the area, Saudi Arabia, are the ones that are exporting all the terrorism. But where are their best buddies? I don't understand what planet I live on anymore, George.
Well, I couldn't put it better than you have, and so I'm not going to try. I'm just wondering how it genuinely mystifies me, how it is that the American political class, overwhelmingly the American media, except some quite exceptional and unexpected voices like Tucker Carlson, for example, on Fox News, the American political and media class appear utterly untroubled by the fact that they have become the de facto allies of the very people that carried out the terrorist atrocity against the United States on 9/11/2001. How can that not trouble you?
And George, that's one of my main points is, how many Iranians attacked us on 9/11? Zero. How many Saudis attacked us on 9/11? What was it, 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis?
Either 13 or 15. And all of them were motivated by the Wahhabist Takfiri madness, the fountainhead of which is Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
You couldn't make it up. You couldn't make it up.
But I'm supposed to believe that Soleimani is the bad guy.
Yeah, extraordinary. Listen, Dave, all the phone lines are full. The switchboard is completely full. So I'll say goodnight to you, if I may, in Warsaw, because there's a legend on the line. Let's hear from Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. Dennis, I wrote his name down from Brooklyn, said really what I wanted to say. So it's not much. But, you know, why did Trump do it? I mean, what did he hope to gain? And he's losing control, and, you know, it's a no-win situation.
I honestly think he might have gone mad by now.
Yeah, I think so.
I genuinely fear for the sanity of the most powerful man on the planet.
Well, I hope he goes to an asylum, and, you know, Bernie Sanders comes along and he's impeached Trump, and that's the only way I can think of getting out of this situation, you know?
Can you imagine him in Ward 5 at Broadmoor? I can. Holding court, the big orange man.
Oh, dear. I don't know what I'd do with him, really.
It's very, very, very dangerous. If the Iranians respond, as I'm certain that they will, and he then responds in what he says is a disproportionate manner, destroying cultural sites and so on, and thus triggering a regional war of enormous proportions. God save us, please. God save us. Let's pray that that does not happen. Norma, how's your husband? We haven't had a bulletin for a little while.
No, actually, we are deteriorating, George.
We're all deteriorating. The question is, at what rate?
Well, you know, he can't walk very well, and I can't breathe very well. So,
well, stop smoking, fag-ass.
Oh, I know, but you see, all this tension.
You can't breathe very well, but
I know.
You're still puffing away. Well,
Not
take
very
my
often.
advice. I'm 5 years off tobacco now, and I intend to live for another 35 years on the strength of it. Norma, thank you very much indeed. Lord Swift says, none of us know the intelligence the USA had pre-strike. Most folk, if honest, wouldn't have known the target's name before the strike. It's easy to get caught up in the set pro-hate Trump lines. History will decide whether this was the right move. History is coming your way, Lord Swift, very quickly. Informed Dissent says Johnson is in the same political party as Trump. It's called the International Democrat Union. And Dundee Vibe says never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. I think Napoleon's great dictum. And Nadir says under this circumstance, and since Trump is a liability to his country and to the US alliance, the UK shall devise a contingency plan to deal exclusively with the US Congress, as it is the only legitimate entity that represents the people of the United States. Guy is in Stoke-on-Trent. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, hi, George. George, I know we've had differences over Brexit, but I really must say it's been an interesting show this evening.
Thank you, my friend.
And credit where credit's
Brexit is last year. We're on to new battles now.
And credit where credit's due. You must surely be the most knowledgeable and informed politician or ex-politician in this country.
There's no X about it, Guy.
Okay, well, in that case,
as long as God gives me breath. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
But my point really being that you understand the relationships, the allegiances, the history of the Middle East, and you deserve a bigger platform than what you're getting at the moment. And it's such a shame that you don't get some major mainstream coverage. If only people can listen to you and decide, make an informed decision, as I believe that the mainstream narrative on this is very one-sided. Almost.
Well, look, Guy, it's exceedingly kind of you to say these things, especially as we did have our differences. But I've got to put you right on something. The mainstream media, as you and others imagine it, is no longer actually mainstream. And the numbers of people that I'm speaking to right now, and my words will reach through the course of this week online before we get to next Sunday, utterly dwarfs anything that you might think of as the mainstream media. I mean, short of being on the Graham Norton show, I could not be speaking to more people than I currently am. Almost 1 million people will watch this show. Almost 1 million will watch. Never mind listen, because we can't count them. Almost 1 million people will listen to this show. Do you know how many people watch Sky News or BBC Question Time? Do you know how many people watch Newsnight? Do you know how many people read The Guardian or The Independent? It is tiny by comparison with the audience of the mother of all talk shows right now. I had an audience on talk radio, a little local London radio station, 29 weeks ago, and I was probably reaching 30,000 people by the end. Now I'm talking to almost 1 million. So don't cry for me, Argentina. I am reaching more people now than I have ever reached in my life. I told you earlier, my 6-month-old broadcast from June on Iran was relaunched less than 72 hours ago and got 1 million views in less than 72 hours. So spread the news. Spread, hallelujah, spread the news that there's an alternative to the mainstream media. It's called the mother of all talk shows. It's on RT. It's on Sputnik. It's on my Facebook, my YouTube, my Twitter. And more and more and more people are tuning in to it. So I've got to tell you, Guy, and I'm grateful and touched by what you had to say. We are the new mainstream, and we should not allow them to imagine. If someone calls me now, the only person I respond to is Piers Morgan. If Piers Morgan invites me on his show, I go there because I like the show and I like him. But if somebody called me for a comment from The Independent or The Telegraph, why would I pick up the phone to them only to be distorted in what I had to say? Why would I travel across London to go on Newsnight so the perpetrators of Newsnight could seek to persuade the public that I'm some kind of criminal or madman or both? Why would I do that? I can speak to you directly, without censorship, without distortion. And that's what I am doing. And you, by building this huge audience, are doing a great service, not to me, but to yourselves and to the public realm, to the public discourse. Because whether you agree with what you've heard here this evening or not, you have to acknowledge that these arguments, these perspectives, this point of view has to be heard. and that we have a track record of being correct. Far more of a track record of turning out to be right than those who disparage us but continue to imagine they are the mainstream media. It's been marvelous. Thanks for joining me. See you next week, God willing.